The wind that tore through the Wyoming Territory in the late autumn of 1878 did not merely blow, it scoured. It carried the grit of 3 states, driving hard. Abrasive dust into the cracks of clapboard buildings and the lines of weather-beaten faces. In the town of Bitter Creek, the main street was less a road and more a scarred channel of hard-packed earth, flanked by a livery stable that smelled of wet hay and ammonia, a saloon that leaked the sour scent of mash whiskey, and a whitewashed church that looked as though it was clinging to the ground for dear life. Ruth Hale sat on the tailgate of a freight wagon, her boots hovering a foot above the dust. The driver, a man with a beard like a tangled tumbleweed and eyes that had seen too much empty horizon, climbed down and began unhitching his team without looking at her. He had brought her as far as his route went, and his charity had expired the moment the wheels stopped turning. Ruth gripped the handle of her carpetbag until her knuckles turned the color of old parchment. The bag contained everything she owned in the world: 2 changes of threadbare clothes, a Bible with a broken spine, a comb missing 3 teeth, and a heavy wool shawl that smelled of wood smoke. She slid off the wagon, her legs stiff from hours of jostling. When her boots hit the ground, a puff of dust rose to coat the hem of her dress, which was already stained with the grime of travel. The driver slapped the rump of the near horse. "You best find shelter." "Missus," he muttered, keeping his back to her. "This wind has teeth, and the sun is dropping fast." Ruth nodded, though he was not looking. "Thank you for the ride," she said. Her voice was a rasp, dry as the air around them. She stood alone in the street as the wagon rattled away toward the livery. The town felt hostile, a collection of gray and brown structures hunkered down against the coming winter. She was 24 years old, though the mirror told her she looked 30. She had no money, no kin within 500 miles, and a hunger that had moved past pain into a dull, hollow ache in her center. She straightened her spine. Ruth had learned long ago that the world liked to kick a dog that cowered. If she looked like a stray, they would treat her like one. If she looked like a woman with a purpose, perhaps they would let her survive the night. Her first stop was the boarding house, a 2-story building with a peeling sign that swung violently in the gusts. She climbed the steps, smoothing her wind-tattered hair, and knocked. The door opened to reveal a woman with arms the size of cured hams and a face set in permanent suspicion. "I am looking for work," Ruth said, keeping her chin high, cleaning, cooking, mending. "I have a strong back and I'm quick with a needle." The woman looked Ruth up and down, noting the travel stains, the dark circles under her eyes, and the lack of a husband at her elbow. "We are full up," the woman said flatly. "And we have a colored girl for the cleaning." "I can work for a meal and a floor to sleep on." Ruth pressed, desperation cracking her facade just slightly. "I do not need a bed, just a corner out of the wind." The woman stepped back and began to close the door. "We run a respectable house here. We do not take in drifters. Try the saloon if you are looking to trade favors for a bed." The door shut with a definitive thud. Ruth stood there for a long moment, staring at the wood grain, forcing herself not to cry. Tears were a waste of water. Her first husband had told her once, usually right before he gave her a reason to shed them. She tried the laundry next. The air inside was hot and thick with the smell of lye soap and boiling water. 3 Chinese women worked over steaming tubs. They looked up as Ruth entered, their expressions guarded. When she asked for work, the eldest simply shook her head and pointed to the crowded room. There was no space for another pair of hands. The sun began to dip behind the jagged line of the western hills, painting the sky in bruised purples and bloody oranges. The temperature plummeted with the light. Ruth could feel the cold searching for the gaps in her thin coat. She made her way to the general store, the largest building in town, hoping that perhaps they needed someone to stock shelves or sweep. A bell jingled as she entered. The warmth inside was staggering, smelling of coffee beans, leather, and peppermint. A woman stood behind the counter, polishing a glass jar. She was dressed in fine calico, her hair pinned up strictly. Ruth approached the counter. "Excuse me, ma'am." The woman paused, her eyes narrowing as they swept over Ruth. The assessment was quick and brutal. "We have no handouts," the woman said before Ruth could finish. "I am not asking for charity," Ruth said, her voice trembling with a mix of cold and anger. "I am asking for work. I can scrub the floors. I can organize the stock." The woman laughed. A short, sharp sound like a dry twig snapping. "Look at you. You are practically falling over. My husband does not hire strays, and neither do I. If you have money to buy, put it on the counter. If not, get out. You are letting the heat out." Ruth looked down at her left hand. A gold band sat on her ring finger, thin and worn. It was the last tether to a life that had been a misery, but it was also the only thing of value she possessed. She twisted it, feeling the metal bite into her skin. She could sell it. It might buy her a week at the boarding house, or a ticket on the stagecoach to the next town. But if she sold it, she admitted that the past 5 years had happened for nothing. She admitted she was truly erased. "I have no money," Ruth whispered. "Then you have no business here," the woman said, turning her back to wipe down a shelf. Ruth walked out into the twilight. The wind had picked up, howling down the street like a wounded animal. Her stomach cramped violently. She had not eaten a full meal in 3 days. Only a crust of bread she had saved from the day before yesterday. The saloon was the only building with light spilling generously onto the boardwalk. Laughter and the tinny sound of a piano drifted out. Ruth had never set foot in a saloon in her life. Her upbringing had been strict, and her husband had been the type of drinker who forbade his wife from seeing the source of his vice. But the cold was becoming a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders. She pushed through the swinging doors. The air inside was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies. Men stood in clumps at the bar or sat at round tables playing cards. The noise dipped slightly as she entered, heads turning to inspect the new arrival. Ruth kept her eyes on the floor and walked straight to the bar. The owner was a heavy man with grease slicked through his hair and eyes that looked like black beads. He was wiping a glass with a rag that looked dirtier than the counter. "Please," Ruth said, her voice barely carrying over the piano. "Do you need help? I can wash glasses. I can sweep." The barkeep leaned over the wood, bringing with him the scent of onions and stale sweat. "We got a boy for the sweeping," he said. He looked her over, lingering on the curve of her neck and the flush of cold on her cheeks. "But a pretty thing like you could earn good money upstairs." Ruth recoiled as if he had slapped her. She took a step back, bumping into a chair. "I am not. I do not do that." The barkeep shrugged. "Cold night to be choosy. Darling, the offer stands if you change your mind. $5 a night, 3 for you, 2 for the house." Ruth turned to leave, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She needed to get out. She would find a barn, a porch, anything. As she passed a table near the door, a hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. It was a ranch hand, his face flushed with drink, his eyes swimming. "Whoa there, little lady," he slurred. "You look like you need a drink. Why don't you sit on my lap and warm up?" "Let go of me," Ruth said, tugging at her arm. His grip was iron hard. "Come on now, don't be like that." The man laughed, pulling her off balance. He smelled of whiskey and horses. "You heard the man. Upstairs is open for business. Let's you and me go see it." He yanked her hard, trying to pull her toward the staircase at the back of the room. Panic, bright and white, flared in Ruth's mind. It was the same grip, the same smell of liquor, the same entitlement she had lived with for 5 years. She did not think. She reacted. She planted her feet, twisted her arm, and swung her free hand with every ounce of strength she had left. Her palm connected with the man's cheek with a crack that silenced the room. The man let go, stumbling back, his hand going to his face. The saloon went deadly quiet for a heartbeat, and then laughter erupted from his companions. "She made you good, Jilly," a man at the next table roared. The man named Jilly turned back to Ruth, his face twisting from shock into ugly rage. "You ungrateful little bitch," he snarled. He reached for her again, his intent clear in the bunching of his shoulders. Ruth backed up, hitting the wall. There was nowhere to go. She raised her hands, bracing for the blow. That is enough." The voice was not loud, but it cut through the noise like a knife through canvas. A man detached himself from the shadows of a corner table. He was tall, with shoulders that spanned a yard wide, dressed in a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his eyes. He moved with a heavy, deliberate grace, stepping between Ruth and the drunk. "Get out of the way." "Cooper," Jilly spat. "She struck me, because you put your hands on her," the man named Cooper said. His voice was a deep rumble, calm, but laced with a warning that made the hair on the back of Ruth's neck stand up. "You are drunk, Jilly. Go sleep it off before you do something that will get you buried." "I ain't afraid of you," Jilly blustered, though he took a half-step back. "You should be," Cooper said. The two men stared at each other. The room held its breath. Ruth pressed herself against the rough wood of the wall, her chest heaving. She looked at the man defending her. He was in his late 30s, perhaps with a face carved from granite, hard planes, a square jaw, and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. But it was his eyes that held her. They were dark, tired, and haunted by something that looked remarkably like her own desperation. Jilly scoffed, spat on the floor near Cooper's boots, and turned away. "Not worth it anyway," he muttered. "Scrawny things like that." Cooper waited until the man had retreated to the bar before turning to Ruth. He did not touch her. He stood a respectful distance away, removing his hat to reveal hair streaked with premature gray. "Are you harmed, ma'am?" he asked. "No," Ruth managed to whisper. "Thank you. This is no place for you," he said, his gaze flicking around the room where eyes were still lingering on them. "Come with me." He did not wait for an answer, nor did he grab her arm to lead her. He simply walked toward the door, his body creating a wake that she could follow. Ruth hesitated for only a second before grabbing her carpetbag and hurrying after him. Outside, the cold hit them like a physical blow. The wind had intensified, rattling the loose boards of the boardwalk. Elias Cooper buttoned his coat but seemed impervious to the chill. He looked at Ruth, who was shivering violently now that the adrenaline was fading. "There is a bench down at the end of the street, near the livery office. He said, it is out of the wind. I can get the host to bring us some coffee. You look like you are about to fall down." "I cannot pay you," Ruth said, her teeth chattering. "I did not ask you to," Elias replied. He led her to a small, sheltered alcove between the livery and the saddlemaker's shop. He disappeared for a moment and returned with 2 steaming tin cups. He handed one to her. Ruth wrapped her frozen hands around the metal, letting the heat seep into her palms. She took a sip. It was bitter and strong, scalding her tongue in a wonderful way. Elias sat on a crate opposite her, stretching his long legs out. He watched her drink, his expression unreadable. "You are new to town," he stated. It was not a question. "I arrived on the wagon this afternoon," Ruth said. "And you have nowhere to stay?" "No." Elias took a slow sip of his coffee. "I am Elias Cooper. I run a spread north of the river. Ruth Hale." She said, "Ruth," he repeated, testing the name. "What brings a woman like you to a place like this alone?" "Mrs. Hale. And I assume it is Mrs., seeing the ring." Ruth looked down at the band on her finger. "I am a widow," she said. "My husband. He died 6 months ago." "I am sorry for your loss," Elias said automatically. "Do not be," Ruth said sharply. She surprised herself with the honesty. The cold, the hunger, and the fear seemed to have stripped away her polite filters. He was not a good man. Elias raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He waited. Ruth took another drink, the coffee warming her belly. "We had a small farm in Kansas, hardscrabble land. Silas. He drank away the profits before we made them. He liked to control things, every coin, every moment of my day. If I smiled at a neighbor, I paid for it later. If supper was cold, I paid for it." She paused, listening to the wind whistle past their shelter. "He died in a fall. He came home drunk, stumbled on the porch steps, and broke his neck." That is what the sheriff wrote down. "And the farm?" Elias asked. The bank took it the day after the funeral. She said, "Debts I did not know existed. I tried to go to his cousins in Nebraska, but they did not want an extra mouth to feed, so I kept moving west. I thought there might be work in the territories." She looked up at him, her eyes swimming with exhaustion. "I just want to work, Mr. Cooper. I want a place where I can lock the door and sleep without wondering who is coming through it. I am not a beggar. I just need a chance." Elias looked at her for a long time. He saw the frayed cuffs of her dress, the hollows of her cheeks, and the way she held herself with a rigid, fragile dignity. She was like a bird caught in a gale, beating its wings against the inevitable. He set his cup down on the boardwalk. "I know about land that eats you alive," he said quietly. "I own 10,000 acres of it. It demands everything: money, sweat, blood. It took my father, and it is trying its best to take me." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "My father's will is a complicated thing. The ranch is mine, but there is a clause. He wanted to ensure the Cooper line continued. If I do not have a legitimate heir, a child born in wedlock, by the time I am 40, the control of the land can be contested. My brother, Wade, he is waiting for that day like a buzzard on a fence post." Ruth watched him, confused. "Why are you telling me this?" Elias looked away, staring into the dark street. "I had a wife once, Esther. She was a good woman, soft, too soft for this country. She died 5 years ago. In childbirth?" Ruth guessed softly. Elias nodded, a spasm of pain crossing his face. "And before that, 3 others that never made it to term. The doctor, he told me, after Esther passed, that the fault likely lay with me, that my seed was weak, that I would never father a living child." Ruth felt a pang of sympathy. To a man of the West, legacy was everything. To be told you were at the end of the line was a heavy sentence. So I believed him. Elias said, "I mourned my wife and I mourned the children I would never have. I let the house go quiet. I let Wade make his jokes about my empty rooms. But," he turned his gaze back to her, and the intensity of it pinned her in place, "I am a stubborn man, Mrs. Hale, and lately I have found that I cannot accept it. I look at my land, and I cannot bear the thought of Wade tearing it apart, selling it off for whiskey and gambling debts. I need an heir. I need to try, even if the doctor said it was impossible." He took a breath, the air misting in front of his face. "I need a wife. Not for romance. I am done with that. And I suspect you are too. I need a woman who is strong enough to survive this valley. A woman who needs a home as much as I need a child." Ruth froze, the coffee cup suspended halfway to her mouth. She stared at him, trying to process the shift in conversation. Are you mocking me?" she whispered. "I have never been more serious," Elias said. He stood up, towering over her, casting a long shadow. "I am offering a trade. Ruth, I have a large house with empty rooms. I have food in the larder and wood for the fires. I can give you a name that commands respect in this town. No one will look at you like a stray dog if you are Mrs. Elias Cooper. And in return?" Ruth asked, her voice barely audible. "You run my house," Elias said. "You cook, you keep order, and you share my bed. You give me a child, if God allows it. If not, then you will still have a home for as long as you live. I will not cast you out." Ruth's mind reeled. It was madness. A stranger proposing marriage on a dusty boardwalk after 10 minutes of conversation. A part of her, the part that had been bruised and battered by a husband who treated her like property, screamed to run. He was just another man wanting to use her body for his own ends. But another part of her looked at the dark, freezing street. She thought of the gnawing hunger in her belly. She thought of the saloon owner's greasy smile and the $5 offer. She thought of the wind cutting through her dress. He was offering safety. He was offering a door she could lock. She looked at his face. It was grim, yes, and scarred by grief, but there was no cruelty in it. There was a desperate honesty. He was as lonely as she was, just with more money. I do not know what to say," she stammered. "Say you will think about it," Elias said. He sounded exhausted now, as if the speech had drained him. I need time, she said. Elias nodded. I stay at the boarding house when I'm in town. The ranch is too far for a night ride. I will be at the livery at dawn to get my horse. Meet me there. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver dollar. Take this. Get a room for the night. Ruth looked at the coin glinting in the moonlight. Her pride flared, hot and sharp. No, she said. I will not take your money. Not unless I earn it. Elias looked at her, and a flicker of respect lit his eyes. As you wish, but the offer stands. Dawn. He tipped his hat and walked away, his boots thudding heavily on the wood. Ruth watched him go until he disappeared into the darkness. She sat alone for a long time. The cold was sinking into her bones, turning her blood to slush. She finally stood up and walked back toward the boarding house, but her courage failed her. She could not beg again. She went to the church, trying the heavy oak doors, but they were locked tight against the night. She wandered to the livery stable. The main doors were closed, but a side door was unlatched. She slipped inside. The air was warmer here, smelling of horses and sweet hay. It was dark, save for the moonlight filtering through the cracks in the roof. Ruth found an empty stall in the back. She gathered scattered hay into a pile and curled up in the corner, pulling her thin shawl tight around her shoulders. She could hear the horses shifting in their stalls, their heavy breathing a rhythmic comfort. She closed her eyes, but sleep did not come. Instead, she saw Elias Cooper's face. She saw the hunger in his eyes, not for her, specifically, but for a future. He wanted a child. He wanted to defeat the fate that had been pronounced over him. She touched her stomach. Could she do it? Could she lay with a stranger, let him touch her, risk the pain and danger of childbirth again? She remembered the fear of her first marriage, the feeling of being trapped. Would this be a different cage, just with gilded bars? But then she felt the draft whistling through the stable boards, biting at her exposed skin. She imagined waking up tomorrow with nowhere to go, the town's rejection fresh and raw. She imagined starving. Elias Cooper lay awake in his narrow bed at the boarding house. The room was cold, but he was sweating. He stared at the ceiling, replaying the conversation. He had sounded like a fool, a desperate, lonely fool. Why had he asked her? There were women in town, widows, spinsters, who would have jumped at the chance to be mistress of the Cooper ranch. But when he looked at them, he saw calculations. He saw women who wanted his money, or who pitied his history. In Ruth Hale, he had seen something else. He had seen a fighter. When she had slapped that drunk, he had seen a spark of fire that he hadn't felt in his own life for years. And when she spoke of her dead husband, he saw a woman who understood that life was not a fairy tale. She knew the darkness. He thought of the doctor's words. Infertile. The word burned him. It made him feel less than a man. If he married her and nothing happened, if months turned to years and her belly remained flat, would she hate him? Would she look at him with the same pity Esther had shown near the end? Or worse, would she leave? He turned over, the springs creaking. He was terrified. But the thought of Wade walking into his house, claiming his father's chair, claiming the land Elias had bled for, that terror was greater. The sun rose gray and reluctant. The wind had died down, leaving a stillness that felt heavy. Elias dressed in the dark, pulled on his coat, and walked to the livery. The air inside was freezing. The horses were restless, waiting for their feed. Elias walked down the row of stalls toward his black gelding. As he passed the last empty stall, he saw a shape in the shadows. He stopped. Ruth was curled in a tight ball in the corner, half buried in hay. She was shivering in her sleep, small tremors shaking her entire frame. Elias felt a sharp pang of guilt in his chest. He should have forced her to take the money. He should have dragged her to the hotel himself. He opened the stall door, the hinges creaking. Ruth jerked awake, scrambling backward, her eyes wide and terrified. She gasped, her breath clouding in the frigid air. "It is only me," Elias said softly, holding up his hands. "It is Elias." Ruth blinked, the terror slowly receding as she recognized him. She tried to stand, but her legs were stiff with cold. She stumbled, and Elias stepped forward, catching her by the elbows. His grip was firm but gentle, holding her up. Through her thin sleeves, he could feel how cold she was. Her lips were tinged with blue, and her skin was pale as milk. "You stayed here?" he asked, his voice rough. "I had nowhere else," she whispered. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably. Elias looked at her, this small, freezing woman who had chosen a pile of hay over compromising her dignity. The decision that had been forming in his mind solidified into something unbreakable. This was not just about an heir anymore. He could not leave her here. He pulled off his heavy gloves, his hands warm and calloused. He reached out and took her hand, chafing it between his own to bring the blood back. "Ruth," he said, dropping the formalities. "Look at me." She looked up, her eyes gray and guarded. "My offer stands," he said. "I am going to church this morning. The pastor is there. We can say the vows before noon. Then I will take you home. You will have a fire, a hot meal, and a bed with a quilt thick enough to bury you." He paused, squeezing her fingers. "I will be a good husband to you, Ruth. I swear it. I will not raise a hand to you. I will not keep you hungry. We will make a contract for it, if that helps you. But come with me, please." Ruth looked at him. She felt the warmth of his hands seeping into hers. She saw the fear in his eyes, fear that she would say no, fear that he would have to ride back to that empty house alone. She realized then that he was offering her a rescue. Yes, but he was asking for one in return. She took a trembling breath, the air sharp in her lungs. She thought of the long road behind her and the closed doors of the town. She looked at this man who was scared and frightened and stubborn. "Yes," she whispered. Elias exhaled, a sound of profound relief. "Yes, I will marry you. Elias Cooper." He nodded, his face serious. "Good. That is good." He unbuttoned his coat and draped it over her shoulders. It was heavy and smelled of tobacco and horse, enveloping her in warmth. "Let's get you out of the cold," he said. He led her out of the stall and into the gray morning light. Ruth walked beside him, clutching the lapels of his coat, stepping toward a future she could not quite see, hoping against hope that she was not walking into another fire. The interior of the First Church of Bitter Creek was as dry and colorless as the bones of the cattle that sometimes bleached in the ravines south of town. The air inside smelled of beeswax and old hymnals, a scent that usually promised sanctuary, but today felt stagnant. The ceremony was hurried, squeezed in between the pastor's mid-morning tea and his preparation for the Wednesday prayer meeting. Ruth stood at the altar, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles were white. She was still wearing the travel-stained dress she had arrived in, the hem heavy with dust. Beside her, Elias Cooper loomed like a mountain, his good dark coat smelling of cedar and tobacco. There were no flowers. There was no music. The only witnesses were the sleepy-eyed boy who swept the floors and the man from the livery stable, who leaned against a pew looking as though he would rather be mucking stalls. Reverend Thomas hurried through the liturgy, his voice a monotone drone that stripped the words of their majesty. He looked over his spectacles at them, his gaze lingering on Ruth's frayed cuffs before flicking back to his book. In the back pew, the pastor's wife, Mrs. Thomas, sat with Mrs. Gable, the banker's wife. They made no effort to lower their voices. "It is a charity case. That is what it is." "Mrs." Thomas whispered, her voice carrying in the hollow silence. "He pulled her out of a horse stall this morning. A homeless widow. And now she is to be the mistress of the Cooper Ranch. It is unseemly, Mrs. Gable sniffed, adjusting her bonnet. "Wade will be furious. Imagine a stray dog sitting at the Cooper table. I give it 6 months before she runs off with the silver." Ruth heard every word. She stiffened, her gaze fixed on the wooden cross behind the pulpit. She felt a flush of shame creep up her neck, hot and stinging. She wanted to turn and shout that she was not a thief, that she was a woman doing what she must to survive, but she held her tongue. She had learned long ago that shouting at respectable women only proved their low opinion of you. Elias shifted beside her. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. He had heard them too. He did not turn around, but he reached out and took Ruth's hand. His grip was firm, almost crushing, an unspoken assertion of solidarity. "With this ring, I thee wed," Elias rumbled. His voice was deep, drowning out the whispers in the back. He produced a plain gold band from his vest pocket. It was simple, unadorned, but thick and solid. He slid it onto her finger. It was a little loose, for her hands had grown thin from hunger, but it shone with a promise of permanence. His hand, broad and calloused from years of rope and rain, swallowed hers completely. Ruth looked up at him. For the first time that morning, their eyes met fully. She expected to see only the practical arrangement they had made, the transaction of shelter for service. But in the depths of his dark eyes, she saw something else. There was an apology there, and a quiet, steady warmth that countered the chill of the church. "Ruth, take thee, Elias," she whispered, her voice trembling. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, there was no kiss. Elias simply nodded to the pastor, placed a generous stack of coins on the altar rail, more than the service was worth, likely to buy silence, and offered Ruth his arm. "Let us go." "Mrs. Cooper," he said. The name sounded strange to her ears, heavy and borrowed. She took his arm, and they walked out into the blinding noon sun, leaving the whispers trapped in the shadows behind them. Their first stop was the general store. Elias marched in with Ruth trailing a step behind him. The bell above the door jingled cheerfully, a stark contrast to the tension in Ruth's shoulders. Mr. Higgins, the proprietor, looked up from his ledger. "Good morning." "Elias, what can I do for you? My wife needs provisions," Elias said flatly. "Mr. Higgins' eyebrows shot up toward his receding hairline. His gaze shifted to Ruth, and his mouth formed a perfect O of surprise. "Behind the counter, Mrs." Higgins stopped stacking tins of peaches and turned slowly, her eyes narrowing as she took in Ruth's appearance. "Your wife, Mrs." Higgins repeated. "We were married this hour," Elias said. He did not offer explanations. He did not introduce Ruth as a long-lost love or a cousin from the East. He simply stated the fact as if it were as immutable as the weather. "She requires clothing. She has lost her baggage in travel. We need sturdy boots, 3 dresses for working, 1 for Sunday, a heavy wool shawl, and whatever undergarments are necessary." Ruth stood by the barrel of pickling cucumbers, feeling the weight of Mrs. Higgins' judgment. The shopkeeper's wife wiped her hands on her apron. Her lips pursed into a line so thin it nearly vanished. "This way," she said to Ruth, her tone clipped. For the next hour, Ruth was measured and fitted, Mrs. Higgins offered no congratulations. She pulled bolts of fabric with aggressive snaps of her wrist and sighed loudly when Ruth hesitated over a choice. "Not the silk," Ruth said softly, touching a bolt of blue calico. "This one. It will wear better, Mrs." Higgins sniffed. "It is the cheapest bolt we have. It is practical," Ruth insisted. When Elias joined them at the counter to pay, the pile of goods was substantial. There were high-button boots of good leather, thick wool stockings, flannel for nightgowns, and a heavy gray shawl that looked warm enough to turn a blizzard. Elias paid in gold. He did not haggle. As he gathered the packages, Ruth saw Mrs. Higgins lean over to her husband and whisper something behind her hand, her eyes darting toward Ruth's midsection. Ruth looked away, focusing on the scent of coffee beans and leather. She felt like a doll being dressed up, a mannequin draped in finery that did not belong to her. But then she touched the soft wool of the shawl tucked under her arm. It was new. It had no holes. It smelled of the store, not of mildew or sweat. She looked at Elias's broad back as he carried the heavier bundles to the door. He was providing for her. He was shielding her from the cold. The sting of the town's disapproval was sharp. Yes, but the comfort of that wool was real. For the first time in 5 years, she was not facing the winter alone. They left town in the early afternoon. Elias had traded his saddle horse for a small buckboard wagon to carry Ruth and her new belongings. The town of Bitter Creek fell away behind them, reducing to a collection of toys on a dusty rug. The land unrolled before them, vast and indifferent. It was a landscape of browns and golds, of dry, brittle grass that hissed in the wind and distant hills that looked like the bruised knuckles of the earth. The sky was too big, a sprawling dome of relentless blue that made human concerns feel trivial. Ruth sat on the hard wooden seat, gripping the edge as the wagon bounced over ruts. The wind pushed dust into her face, stinging her eyes, but she did not turn away from it. She breathed deep. The air here was clean, smelling of sagebrush and dry earth. "It is a long ride," Elias said, breaking the silence that had stretched for miles. 3 hours, if the horses keep a good pace." Ruth nodded. "It is beautiful," she said, in a hard way. Elias glanced at her, surprised. "Most folks find it desolate. My mother hated it. She said the wind sounded like it was trying to scrub the names off the gravestones." Ruth looked at the horizon. "I think I like that it is big," she said. "It makes me feel small. When you are small, it is harder to be hit." Elias was quiet for a moment, digesting this. He flicked the reins gently. "That ridge there," he said, pointing with his whip handle to a jagged spine of rock rising to the west. "We call that the Sentinel. When the snow comes, it hits there first. If you see white on the Sentinel, you have 2 hours before the storm hits the house." "And the river?" Ruth asked, nodding toward the silver ribbon winding through the cottonwoods in the distance. "The Sweetwater." Elias said, "The name is a lie. It is muddy half the year and frozen the other half. But in the spring, when the melt comes down from the high country, it floods the bottomlands. It brings the grass back." His voice softened as he spoke of the land. The gruff, defensive tone he used in town evaporated. He spoke of the water tables, of the best canyons for wintering cattle, of the way the light hit the red cliffs at sunset. Ruth listened, realizing that this man was not just a rancher who owned the land. He belonged to it. He was as much a part of this valley as the sagebrush. She felt a strange sense of freedom. Out here, with the town out of sight, the gossip meant nothing. The pastor's wife could not whisper to the wind. The sun was dipping low, casting long, stretching shadows across the grass. When the ranch house came into view, Ruth's breath caught in her throat. She had expected a cabin, perhaps a slightly larger version of the homestead shacks she had seen on her journey. What she saw was a sprawling compound that spoke of decades of labor. There were barns, weather-beaten and gray, their roofs sagging slightly under the weight of years. There were corrals made of rough-hewn poles, holding horses that turned to watch the wagon pass. A bunkhouse sat off to one side, smoke curling from its chimney, and in the center stood the main house. It was 2 stories tall, built of timber and stone, with a wide porch wrapping around the front. It had been painted white once, but the wind and sun had scoured much of it away, leaving it a patchwork of gray wood and flaking paint. It looked imposing, lonely, and tired. Elias pulled the wagon up to the front steps. "Welcome to the Double C," he said. Ruth felt a wave of inadequacy wash over her. She looked down at her hands, red from the cold and rough from years of scrubbing other people's floors. She was a drifter, a woman who had slept in a stable that very morning, and now she was supposed to be the mistress of this? A man walked out from the direction of the barn. He was older, his legs bowed from a lifetime in the saddle, his face a roadmap of wrinkles. He took the horses' bridles. "In the afternoon, my boss, the man, grunted. 'Hank,' Elias said, climbing down, 'this is my wife, Mrs. Ruth Cooper.'" Hank did not flinch. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust, wiped his mouth with his sleeve, and touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am, Mr. "Hank," Ruth said, her voice small. "Just Hank. Ma'am," he said. Before she could say more, the front door of the house opened. A woman stepped out onto the porch. She was tall and spare, wearing a severe gray dress and an apron that looked as though it had been starched with iron filings. Her hair was pulled back so tightly, it pulled at her eyes. "Mrs. Pratt," Elias said, helping Ruth down from the wagon. The housekeeper stopped at the top of the steps. She looked at Elias, then at the bundles in the wagon, and finally at Ruth. Her gaze was surgical, She catalogued the new shawl, the nervous posture, the age, and the station of the new arrival in a single sweep. I did not know we were expecting guests. Mr. Cooper, Mrs., Pratt said. Her voice was dry as paper. Not a guest, Elias said, his voice firming. Ruth is my wife. We were married this morning. She will be running the house with you, Mrs. Pratt stood perfectly still for 3 seconds. The silence was loud enough to ring in Ruth's ears. I see, Mrs., Pratt said finally. She gave a single, sharp nod, like a bird pecking at a seed. Well, supper is at 6. I have a roast in. I suppose I can stretch it. She turned her eyes to Ruth. Do you know how to keep a house, Mrs. Cooper, or are you a town woman? I have worked on farms, Ruth said, meeting the older woman's gaze. I can cook, clean, sew, and I am not afraid of blood or dirt. I will not be a burden to you. Mrs. Pratt, Mrs. Pratt's eyes narrowed slightly. Assessing. We shall see, she said. Come inside. The wind is picking up. Ruth followed her into the house, feeling as though she had just passed a test, though she was not sure if she had passed with high marks or barely scraped by. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her gut, that she would have to earn this woman's respect. Mrs. Pratt would not give it away for free, and certainly not just because Ruth wore a gold ring. The interior of the house was dim and clean, smelling of lemon oil and wood smoke. The furniture was heavy and dark, clearly chosen for durability rather than style. Elias carried her bags up the stairs. Mrs. Pratt had retreated to the kitchen, the clatter of pans signaling her displeasure at the disruption of her routine. Elias opened a door at the end of the hallway. This will be your room, he said. Ruth stepped inside. It was a large room with a window looking out over the west pasture. There was a sturdy bed covered in a quilt of the log cabin pattern, a washstand with a pitcher and bowl, and a wardrobe. It was clean, cold, and impersonal. She turned to see Elias standing in the doorway, looking uncomfortable. Your room? She asked. Next door, he said, gesturing to the adjacent door. Ruth felt a confusing mix of emotions. Relief. Certainly, she barely knew this man, and the thought of sharing a bed with a stranger terrified her. But there was also a faint sting. Was she so unappealing? Or was this just business to him? So strictly business that he did not even want her near him. I thought it best, Elias said, rubbing the back of his neck. We are strangers. Ruth, I do not want you to feel cornered. We have time. There is no rush to change things. Ruth nodded slowly. Thank you, Elias. That is kind of you. He looked as though he wanted to say more, but he just nodded once and backed out of the room, closing the door softly. That night, Ruth stood at her window. The moon was high and full, washing the ranch yard in a ghostly silver light. She could hear the wind singing around the eaves of the house, searching for a way in. In the distance, the yipping howl of a coyote rose and fell, a lonely, wild sound. She looked at the solid walls around her. She touched the quilt on the bed. It was real. She was safe. But as the house creaked under the assault of the wind, she realized that safety in the West was an illusion. A home was just wood and nails standing against a wilderness that wanted to tear it down. It was always one storm away from being broken. The next few days fell into a rhythm that was exhausting and saving. Ruth rose before the sun, shivering as she dressed in the dark, and went down to the kitchen to start the fire before Mrs. Pratt appeared. She learned quickly that the way to Mrs. Pratt's heart, or at least to her tolerance, was competence. Ruth took over the baking of the bread, kneading the heavy dough until her arms ached. She scrubbed the pine floors until her knees were bruised. She peeled mountains of potatoes for the hungry hands who ate in the bunkhouse. She worked with a ferocity that surprised even herself. She was paying for her life. Every loaf of bread, every swept corner, was a payment on the debt she felt she owed Elias for rescuing her. Elias was gone from dawn until dusk. The ranch was preparing for winter, and the work was endless. He rode out with Hank and the boys to check the fences, to move cattle to the lower pastures, to tally the feed. When he came in at night, he was coated in dust, smelling of sweat and horse. Ruth would set a plate of hot food before him. He would eat hungrily, often in silence, but slowly. The silence changed. It became less awkward. He began to speak in fragments. "Fence is down in the north quarter," he muttered one evening. "Elk tore it up." "Did you fix it?" Ruth asked, pouring him fresh coffee. "Temporary patch. I need to go back with a wire tomorrow." Another night, he looked at the biscuits she had placed on the table. "Mrs. Pratt did not make these." "No," Ruth said. "I did. Are they wrong?" Elias took a bite. He chewed slowly. "They are lighter. Better." It was the most praise she had received in years. Ruth felt a flush of pleasure that she quickly hid by turning to the stove. Their partnership was taking root in these small exchanges, in the passing of salt and the sharing of warmth near the hearth. One evening, a week after their arrival, the wind was howling particularly hard, rattling the window panes. The fire was roaring in the parlor grate. Mrs. Pratt had retired to her room, leaving Ruth and Elias alone. Ruth sat in the armchair, mending one of Elias's shirts. Elias was going over a ledger, his brow furrowed. "Elias?" Ruth said. He looked up, marking his place with a finger. "Yes." Ruth set the sewing down in her lap. "You spoke, that first night. You spoke of an heir, of the need for a child." Elias went still. The ledger closed with a soft thud. "Yes, you said the doctor told you it was impossible, or nearly so." Elias sighed, rubbing his face with his hands. He suddenly looked very tired. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was yellowed at the edges, worn from being opened and refolded 1,000 times. He held it out to her. Ruth took it. The handwriting was cramped and spiked. It detailed the medical history of Mrs. Esther Cooper, the dates of the miscarriages, the date of the birth that killed her, and at the bottom, a stark note regarding Mr. Cooper. Constitution implies weakness of seed, unlikely to produce living issues. Infertility probable. The word infertility seemed to jump off the page. It was clinical, cold, and final. Ruth looked up at him. Her stomach twisted into a knot. "If you believed this, if you carry this with you, why did you ask me? Why did you promise me a chance to be a mother if you knew you could not give it to me?" Elias stood up and walked to the fire. He stared into the flames, his back to her. "Because I am a selfish man," he said, his voice low, "and a stubborn one." He turned to face her. "I refuse to accept it. The doctor is a man, not God. I told myself that perhaps it was just bad luck, that perhaps with a different woman, with time. But you let me believe it was a certainty," Ruth said, her voice rising. She felt a flare of anger. It felt like a trick, like the time her first husband had promised they would have a real house, only to drink the lumber money away. "You used me. You needed a placeholder to keep your brother away, and you dangled a baby in front of me to get me to agree." Elias flinched. "I did not use you, Ruth. I needed an ally. I needed someone who would stand with me against Wade. And I needed to hope." He stepped closer, his hands open at his sides. "Look at me, Ruth. I am nearly 40. I have a house full of ghosts. That note, it brands me. It tells me I am at a dead end, that everything my father built dies with me. Do you know what that feels like? To be broken in the one way that matters for a man out here?" Ruth looked at him. She saw the shame burning in his eyes. It was a raw, naked thing. He was not the powerful rancher in that moment. He was a man terrified of his own inadequacy. Her anger deflated, leaving a hollow ache. She understood shame. She understood the feeling of being less than. She had carried the label of barren and poor and stray for years. "You should have told me the whole truth," she said quietly. "But I understand wanting to defy the verdict." Elias slumped, sitting on the edge of the hearth. "I am sorry. Ruth, if you want to leave, if you want to annul this, I will give you the money to go anywhere you want. Ruth looked at the fire, then at him. She picked up the shirt she was mending. "I have nowhere to go. Elias, and I dug the garden today. I am not leaving my garden." That night, the air in the hallway was thick with unsaid things. When they went upstairs, Elias did not stop at his door. He stopped at hers. "Ruth?" he asked. She turned, her hand on the latch. "We are married." He said, "If we are to try, if we are to prove the doctor wrong, we cannot do it from separate rooms." Ruth's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked at the dark wood of the door. She thought of Silas, her first husband, his rough hands, his whiskey breath, the pain that she had learned to endure by staring at a crack in the ceiling. But Elias was not Silas. Elias had bought her a shawl. Elias had apologized. "Come in," she whispered. The room was dark, lit only by the dying embers in the small fireplace. They undressed in silence, backs turned to each other. The rustle of clothing lulled in the quiet. When they climbed into the high bed, the mattress dipped under Elias's weight. They lay stiffly, a foot of cold sheet between them. Ruth could hear his breathing. It was ragged. "Elias," she said. He reached out. His hand found her shoulder. It was warm. He drew her closer. Ruth stiffened instinctively, waiting for the grab, the crush. But Elias moved slowly. His hand slid down her arm, his fingers tracing the line of her elbow. He smelled of soap and cedar. He kissed her. It was a tentative press of lips, asking a question rather than demanding a right. Ruth exhaled, her body slowly uncoiling. She kissed him back. As the kiss deepened, a spark lit in her belly. It was not fear. It was warm. It was a longing she thought had been beaten out of her years ago. She pressed against him, her hands finding the muscles of his back. Elias groaned low in his throat. He moved over her, his weight heavy and grounding. But then, he froze. Ruth felt his muscles seize. He pulled back abruptly, gasping as if he had been burned. "I can't," he muttered. He scrambled off her, rolling to the far side of the bed. He sat up, head in his hands, his breathing coming in panic-stricken gasps. "Elias?" Ruth asked, confused. "Did I do something wrong?" "No," he choked out. "No, it is." Images flashed through Elias's mind, blood on white sheets. Esther's screams, the tiny, blue silence of the stillborn, the feeling that his desire was a weapon that killed the things he loved. "I cannot hurt you," he whispered. "I cannot do it again." He stood up, grabbing his nightshirt, and stumbled toward the door. "I'm sorry. Ruth, I am sorry." The door clicked shut. Ruth lay alone in the vast, cold bed. The warmth he had left behind faded quickly. She stared at the ceiling, where the shadows of the tree branches danced in the moonlight. Tears pricked her eyes. The old voices rose up, the ones that said she was unlovable, that she was broken goods, that she was not woman enough to keep a man. But beneath the hurt, she heard the echo of his panic. "I cannot hurt you." He was not rejecting her because he despised her. He was rejecting her because he was terrified. She pulled the quilt up to her chin, listening to the wind howl outside, battering the house. They were two damaged people trying to build a shelter out of matchsticks in a gale. She closed her eyes. It was a terrible, fragile beginning. But as she drifted into a restless sleep, she held on to one thought. He had stayed until the fear took him. Next time, perhaps, he would stay longer. The winter did not arrive in the valley with a polite knock. It kicked the door in. By late November, the sky had hardened into a sheet of relentless slate-gray iron that seemed to press down upon the rooftops of the ranch. The wind, which had been a nuisance in the autumn, became a weapon. It screamed down from the peaks of the Sentinel, driving snow into drifts that could swallow a horse whole and freezing the water in the troughs solid within an hour of breaking the ice. The ranch house, for all its sturdy timber and stone, felt small against the vastness of the white wilderness outside. Drafts whispered through gaps in the chinking that no one had noticed in summer, chilling the air until breath smoked in the hallways. Ruth Cooper threw herself into the war against the cold with a ferocity that surprised Mrs. Pratt. The older housekeeper's arthritis flared badly when the pressure dropped, turning her hands into stiff, painful claws. Ruth took over the heavy work without being asked. She hauled water from the pump in the yard, wrapping her hands in rags to keep the skin from sticking to the frozen iron handle. She chopped kindling on the back porch, the axe rising and falling with a rhythm that echoed the beating of her own heart. Steady, necessary, and hard. Inside, she kept the fires fed. It was a constant battle. The wood stove in the kitchen devoured logs, and the hearth in the parlor seemed to suck heat up the chimney as fast as the fire could produce it. Ruth mended clothes by the flickering light of oil lamps, her needle flashing through wool and denim. She pieced together quilts from scraps of old flannel, adding layer upon layer to the bedding in the bunkhouse and the main rooms. She saw Elias mostly in passing during the daylight hours. He and the hands were ghosts in the snow, appearing only to gulp down hot coffee before disappearing back into the white swirl. They rode out to check on the herd, cutting wire fences to let cattle drift to sheltered canyons, breaking trails through the drifts for the stragglers, and dragging calves that had been born too late and too weak into the warmth of the barns. Ruth watched him from the kitchen window. She would wipe the frost from the glass and see him saddling his black gelding in the gray dawn, his breath clouding around his face. He looked exhausted, his shoulders heavy under his shearling coat. Every time he rode out, fading into the veil of falling snow, a sharp pang of worry struck her chest. It was a new feeling, this anxiety for another person's safety. For so long, her only worry had been her own survival. Now, her safety was tied to his, but the fear felt deeper than mere pragmatism. One evening in December, the light was failing early, turning the world a bruised purple. Ruth was in the kitchen, kneading dough for the morning biscuits, when Mrs. Pratt gasped from her chair by the stove. "Look," the housekeeper said, pointing a gnarled finger toward the window. Ruth went to the glass, across the yard, moving fast and silent. A herd of deer was running. They were not grazing. They were fleeing, bounding over the fences and heading for the heavy timber near the creek. They moved with a frantic, fluid urgency. "They know." "Mrs." Pratt murmured. "A big one is coming. A real northerner." Within 20 minutes, the wind changed. The low moan around the eaves turned into a shriek. The temperature plummeted so fast Ruth could almost feel the air tightening. The door burst open, and Elias stumbled in, followed by Hank. They were covered in ice, their eyebrows frosted white. "The weanlings," Elias gasped, tearing off his gloves. "They are stuck in the south corral. If we do not get them into the lower barn, they will freeze standing up tonight." "We need more hands," Hank said, his voice grim. "The boys are scattered." "I'm coming," Ruth said. She was already untying her apron. Elias turned to her, his eyes wide and red-rimmed. "No, it is 20 below zero out there. Ruth, stay by the fire. I have 2 hands and I can walk," Ruth said, grabbing her heavy shawl and the coat Elias had bought her. "You cannot move 20 frightened calves with 2 men." She did not wait for his permission. She pulled her wool hat down over her ears and wrapped her scarf tight. Elias looked at her for a split second, a mixture of frustration and gratitude on his face, and then nodded. "Come on, then. Stay close to me." The cold outside hit Ruth like a physical blow, sucking the air from her lungs. The wind blinded her, stinging her cheeks with ice pellets. They fought their way across the yard to the corral. The calves were huddled in a shivering mass, their eyes rolling in panic. For the next hour, there was no time to think, only to do. Ruth waved her arms, shouting into the gale, pushing against the flanks of terrified animals. The snow was knee-deep and drifting higher. Her skirt soaked through instantly, heavy and freezing against her legs, her boots filled with snow. But she did not stop. She saw Elias wrestling a calf that had gone down, lifting the animal with a grunt of exertion that tore through the wind. She saw Hank shouting orders that were snatched away by the storm. Finally, the last calf stumbled into the warmth of the lower barn. Elias slammed the heavy doors and dropped the bar in place. The sudden silence inside the barn was deafening. The air smelled of wet fur, manure, and hay. They stood there for a moment, chests heaving. Ruth's legs were trembling so violently she thought she might collapse. Elias walked over to her. He grabbed her shoulders, his grip hard. "Are you all right?" Ruth nodded, though her teeth were chattering so hard she could not speak. "Let's get inside," he said. "Now!" The run back to the house was a blur of white. When they spilled into the kitchen, Mrs. Pratt was waiting with hot towels and a pot of coffee that smelled like heaven. Ruth peeled off her frozen coat and sat by the stove, the heat pricking her numb skin like 1,000 needles. Elias sat across from her at the heavy oak table. He looked drained, his face gray with fatigue. His hands, resting on the wood, were shaking, not from fear, but from the deep, bone-marrow chill that settled into a man after hours in the saddle. He stared at his hands as if they belonged to someone else, unable to stop the tremors. Ruth watched him. She saw the man who carried the weight of the land, the cattle, and the people who depended on him. She saw the man who thought he was broken because he could not produce a child, yet who fathered this ranch with every ounce of his blood. Without letting herself think about the propriety of it, Ruth stood up. She poured a mug of coffee, wrapping a towel around it so it was hot but not burning. She walked around the table and placed the mug between Elias's shaking hands. Then, she covered his hands with hers. Her skin was red and raw, but it was warm. She rubbed his knuckles gently, pressing her heat into his frozen flesh. Elias went still. He looked up at her, his dark eyes wide with surprise. He did not pull away. He let out a long, ragged breath and leaned into her touch, his fingers curling slightly to grip the mug and her hands together. "Thank you," he whispered. His voice was rough, stripped of all command. Ruth did not say anything. She just kept rubbing his hands, standing close enough that her skirt brushed his knee. The silence in the kitchen stretched, heavy and sweet. Hank and Mrs. Pratt, busy at the stove, kept their backs turned, granting them a moment of privacy in the crowded room. It was a small thing, a touch of hands over a tin cup, but in the midst of the howling storm, it felt like a vow renewed. The storm blew itself out by the next afternoon, leaving the world buried under 3 feet of brilliant, blinding white. The work did not stop, but the immediate danger had passed. Ruth found herself restless in the house. She had finished the mending, and Mrs. Pratt had reclaimed the kitchen. She wandered into Elias's study, a room she rarely entered. It was a masculine space, smelling of old paper and tobacco. The desk was cluttered with ledgers, tally books, and loose receipts. Ruth picked up a ledger. She had kept the books for her father's farm before she married Silas, and Silas had forced her to manage his debts until there was nothing left to manage. She understood the language of numbers. She sat down and began to read. Elias was a brilliant cattleman, she realized, but a careless bookkeeper. He paid what was asked without question. He bought feed in small batches at high prices rather than bulk. She took a piece of paper and a pencil. For 2 hours, she calculated. She wrote down the price of flour from the Mercantile in Bitter Creek versus the freight cost of ordering barrels from the railhead in Cheyenne. She compared the cost of beans, coffee, and sugar. When Elias came in that evening, stamping snow from his boots, Ruth was waiting for him. "Elias," she said, her voice steady, "I have been looking at the accounts." Elias frowned, hanging his coat on the peg. "The accounts?" Ruth held out the paper. "You are paying 20% more for flour than you need to. And the feed bill. If you bought the winter grain in October instead of December, you would save enough to pay a hand's wages for a month." Elias took the paper. He looked at her neat, schoolteacher script. He looked at the columns of numbers, the subtotals, and the final figures circled at the bottom. It was a significant sum. He looked at her, really looked at her. He had married her for her womb and her domestic labor. He had not expected this. I did not know you had a head for figures," he said, tapping the paper. "My father insisted I learn. Ruth said, and when you have no money, you learn to count every penny twice." Elias sat down in his chair, still holding the paper. Is this right? Are you sure? I checked it 3 times. Ruth said. A slow smile touched Elias's lips, a rare expression that made him look 10 years younger. You are a marvel. Mrs. Cooper. Hank can run a crew, but he counts on his fingers. I have been bleeding money and didn't know it. He looked up at her, and the expression in his eyes changed. It was no longer just gratitude or protective instinct. It was respect. He was looking at a partner. We will do it your way, he said. You handle the orders from now on. Ruth felt a flush of pride warm her chest. It was better than any compliment on her cooking. It was an acknowledgement that she belonged here, that she had value beyond what the doctor said she might provide. A week later, the weather softened slightly, allowing the crews to work in the barns repairing tack. Ruth was in the main barn, searching for a crate of eggs Mrs. Pratt insisted was hidden in the loft. The barn was dim and quiet, save for the shifting of horses. She found the eggs and turned to climb down the ladder. As she reached the bottom, a shadow blocked her path. It was Clay, a young ranch hand with a face that was handsome in a sullen, pinched way. He had been watching her for weeks, his eyes lingering too long on her bodice when she served supper. In the afternoon, Mrs. Cooper, Clay said. He did not move out of her way. Good afternoon. Clay, Ruth said, clutching the basket of eggs. Please let me pass. Clay leaned against the ladder, trapping her in the corner of the stall. You're always rushing off. Too good to talk to the help? I have work to do, Ruth said. Her heart began to beat faster. She knew this tone. She knew the slouch of his shoulders. Work. Clay scoffed. Playing lady of the manor. We all know where Elias found you. Ruth, sleeping in a horse stall like a vagrant. He stepped closer. He smelled of chewing tobacco and unwashed flannel. My cousin in Abilene says he knew a woman who looked just like you. Worked at the Golden Slipper. Said she was friendly enough if you had a silver dollar. Ruth went cold. I have never been to Abilene, she said, her voice shaking. And you will address me as Mrs. Cooper. Clay laughed, a low, ugly sound. Oh, come on. You can't fool me. You're just a stray Elias picked up to warm his bed. I bet you know plenty of tricks. Why don't you show me one? He reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into the soft flesh above her elbow. The touch was a spark in a powder keg. Ruth did not think. Her body remembered 5 years of Silas. It remembered the bruises, the cornering, the feeling of being small and helpless. She was not helpless anymore. She dropped the basket. Eggs shattered on the straw. In the same motion, she brought her knee up, driving it hard into Clay's groin. Clay doubled over with a choked gasp of agony. As his head came down, Ruth shoved him with both hands, screaming a wordless sound of rage. He stumbled back, tripping over a bucket, and sprawled into the muck of the stall floor. Don't you touch me, Ruth screamed, her voice cracking. Don't you ever put your hands on me. The barn doors slid open with a crash. Elias stood there, silhouette framed by the bright snow outside. He took in the scene instantly. The broken eggs, Ruth shaking against the ladder, Clay writhing on the ground, clutching himself. Elias crossed the distance in 3 long strides. He reached down, grabbed Clay by the collar of his coat, and hauled him to his feet as if the man weighed nothing. What did you do? Elias roared. His voice was terrible, a deep, vibrating bass that shook the dust from the rafters. She's crazy, Clay wheezed, his face purple. She attacked me. I was just talking, liar, Ruth cried, tears of adrenaline springing to her eyes. He grabbed me. He said I was a whore. Elias's face went blank. It was a terrifying emptiness, devoid of humanity. He slammed Clay against the rough wood of the stall wall. The younger man's head cracked against the timber. Elias pulled back his fist, the heavy leather glove tight across his knuckles. He was going to kill him. Ruth could see it. He was going to beat this man until he stopped moving. Elias, no! Ruth yelled. Elias froze. His fist hovered inches from Clay's bloody nose. He was breathing like a bellows, his eyes wild. He looked at Clay, then at Ruth. Seeing the terror in her face, he lowered his hand slowly, but he did not let go of the collar. "Get your things," Elias hissed. "What?" Clay stammered. "Get your roll. Saddle your horse. If you are not off my land in 10 minutes, I will shoot you where you stand. And if I ever see you in this valley again, Clay, I will not stop at shooting." He shoved Clay toward the door. The cowboy scrambled away, clutching his ribs. Not daring to look back, Elias turned to Ruth. He looked at her arms, checking for injury. "Did he hurt you?" Ruth shook her head. She was trembling uncontrollably now that the danger was over. "No, I hurt him." Elias looked at the shattered eggs and the marks in the dirt. He reached out and pulled her against his chest. He held her tightly, his hand cradling the back of her head. "You did good," he whispered into her hair. "You did good." Ruth. The story reached town before the week was out. Clay, nursing a bruised ego and a sore groin, spun a tale in the saloons of Bitter Creek. He claimed Ruth had enticed him, then turned on him when he wouldn't give her money. He claimed she was a wildcat, unstable and dangerous. The gossip spread like a stain. On Sunday, when Ruth walked into church, the silence was heavy. Heads turned. Mrs. Thomas, the pastor's wife, pointedly looked at the hymnal when Ruth passed her pew. Ruth heard the whispers, temptress, violent, unstable. She held her head high, gripping Elias's arm, but the words were like small, invisible knives. That evening, the house was quiet. The wind had died down to a low murmur. Ruth and Elias sat by the fire in the parlor. The lamp was turned low, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Ruth stared into the flames. "Elias," she said softly. He looked up from his book. "People are talking about what happened with Clay. Let them talk," Elias growled. "They are sheep." Ruth twisted the ring on her finger. "Clay was right about one thing. I have a violence in me." Elias closed his book. "What do you mean?" Ruth took a deep breath. She had to tell him. If they were to build a life, there could be no more trapdoors. "My first husband, Silas, he did not just fall," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking in her lap. "He was a mean drunk. For 5 years, he hit me. He starved me. He made me feel like I was nothing but a mule to be worked and a body to be used." She looked at Elias. The night he died, he came home in a rage. He had lost money on cards. He came for me. He had a look in his eyes, like he wanted to break something just to hear it snap. He cornered me by the hearth. He grabbed my throat. She paused, the memory vivid and sickening. "I pushed him. I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted him off me. I shoved him as hard as I could. He stumbled back. The rug slipped. His head hit the stone of the hearth. It made a sound, like a melon cracking. Tears spilled down her cheeks. He didn't move. I stood there for an hour, just watching him. I didn't go to the doctor. I let him die. And when the sheriff came, I lied. I said he fell." She looked down at her hands. "So you see, I am not innocent. I have blood on these hands." The silence in the room was absolute. Ruth waited for the judgment. She waited for Elias to recoil, to tell her that he could not harbor a killer. Elias stood up. He walked over to her chair and knelt down. He took her hands, the hands that had warmed him, the hands that had shoved a man to his death, on his own. "Ruth," he said. His voice was low and fierce. "You did not kill an innocent man. You survived a monster." He looked into her eyes, his gaze unwavering. A man who treats a wife like cattle, who puts his hands on her in anger. He forfeits his right to safety. You defended yourself. You did what you had to do to live. "But I lied," she whispered. "You protected yourself," Elias said. "The law out here, it does not always understand what happens behind closed doors. You did what was necessary." He squeezed her hands. "Do not mourn him, Ruth, and do not carry his ghost. He is gone. You are here. You are safe." Ruth looked at him, and the weight that she had carried for 6 months, the crushing, suffocating guilt, began to lift. He knew the worst of her, and he was still kneeling there. 2 nights later, the weather turned vicious again. A blizzard rolled in with terrifying speed. turning the world into a swirling vortex of white. They were eating supper when Hank burst in. "Boss, the south fence line is buried. The heifers are drifting toward the ravine. And Miller hasn't come back from the ridge." Elias was on his feet instantly. "Get the lanterns." "I am coming," Ruth said. Elias started to argue, then looked at her face. He saw the steel there. "Get your coat," he said. They fought the wind together. It was a chaotic nightmare of noise and ice. The lanterns cast feeble circles of yellow light that were swallowed by the snow. They found the cattle huddled near the drop-off of the ravine, bawling in confusion. Ruth worked alongside the men, shouting, waving her arms, driving the beasts back toward safety. But the wind was disorienting. In the confusion, she stepped back, thinking she was on solid ground. Her foot found only air. She slipped, sliding toward the edge of a hidden drainage ditch that was deep enough to break a leg, or worse. "Elias!" she screamed. A hand shot out of the darkness. Elias caught her wrist. He hauled her back with a grunt of effort, pulling her hard against his chest to keep them both from toppling over. They stood there in the roaring dark, bodies pressed together from hip to chest. The snow swirled around them, sealing them in a private, freezing world. Ruth could feel his heart pounding against her own. Her breath mingled with him in the small space between their faces. "Are you hurt?" he shouted over the wind. "No," she yelled back. He didn't let go. He held her tighter. For a moment, the danger, the cold, and the adrenaline fused into something else. It was a raw, desperate need to feel life, to feel heat. "We have to find Miller," Elias shouted, but his hand lingered on her waist for a second too long before he turned back to the storm. They found Miller a half-hour later, huddled under an overhang, half frozen, but alive. They dragged him back to the bunkhouse, then stumbled toward the main house, their bodies numb and heavy. Inside, the heat of the kitchen hit them like a wall. They shed their coats, water pooling on the floor. Misses. Pratt hurried out to tend to Miller, leaving them alone. Ruth stood by the stove, shivering violently. The transition from the freezing dark to the warm light left her dizzy. She couldn't stop shaking. Elias stood next to her. His teeth were chattering. He reached out and took her hands. They were ice cold. He stepped closer. He didn't ask this time. He cupped her face in his rough, cold hands. "I thought I lost you," he rasped. "When you slipped, I thought you were gone." "I am here," Ruth whispered. She leaned into him. She kissed him. It wasn't a tentative kiss like before. It was desperate. It was the kiss of two people who had looked into the abyss and pulled back. Elias made a low sound in his throat. He wrapped his arms around her, crushing her to him. Ruth felt the hunger in him, and it matched her own. She didn't feel fear. She didn't see Silas. She saw Elias, the man who had defended her, the man who had forgiven her, the man who had pulled her from the edge. "Take me upstairs," she whispered against his mouth. Elias swept her up into his arms. He carried her up the stairs, kicking the bedroom door open. The room was cold, but they didn't feel it. He set her on the bed. He undressed her with shaking hands, not out of clumsiness, but out of urgency. When his skin touched hers, it was electric. They huddled under the heavy quilts, limbs tangling, seeking friction and warmth. Elias hovered over her, his face etched with a conflict of desire and terror. He was remembering the blood. He was remembering the fragility of women. Ruth saw it. She reached up and pulled him down. "I am not Esther," she whispered fiercely. "I am strong. Elias, I will not break. Love me, please." The plea broke the dam. Elias kissed her, pouring years of loneliness and grief into the act. He loved her with a mix of tenderness and starvation. And Ruth, for the first time in her life, felt the act not as a taking, but as a giving. It was not painful. It was a claim. It was a fire built against the winter. In the dim light, with the storm howling impotently outside, they found each other. Ruth gasped, arching into him, and Elias buried his face in her neck, fighting back the ghosts until there was only her scent, her heat, and the living pulse of her beneath him. Later, the fire in the hearth had died down to glowing coals. They lay tangled together under the mound of quilts, limbs heavy with exhaustion and peace. Ruth rested her head on Elias's chest, listening to the slow, strong beat of his heart. She felt a sense of belonging that terrified her in its intensity. She was not astray anymore. She was Ruth Cooper, and this was her place. Elias stroked her hair, his large hand gentle. He stared at the ceiling, his other arm wrapped tight around her waist. He felt a profound quiet in his soul that he hadn't known was possible. But as the wind rattled the window pane, the old fear crept back in from the edges of the room. He loved her. He knew that now. And because he loved her, the stakes had risen. His hand drifted down to rest flat on her stomach. It was warm and soft. He closed his eyes, a silent prayer, or perhaps a plea, forming in his mind. Let there be life here, please. Do not let me have raised her hopes only to break her heart. The winter was far from over, and the wind outside promised that the hardest season was yet to come. The spring thaw arrived in the valley not as a gentle awakening, but as a sloppy, chaotic unburdening. The snow that had buried the ranch for months turned into rivers of meltwater, transforming the hard-packed earth into a thick, sucking gumbo of mud. It clung to boots, caked the wheels of wagons, and smelled of wet sage and rotting grass. Yet, beneath the brown sludge, the first hesitant shoots of green were pushing through, stubborn and pale, signaling that the earth had not died under the ice after all. The rhythm of the ranch shifted from survival to labor. The branding irons were pulled from the shed and cleaned of rust. The scent of burning hair and heated metal soon hung in the air near the corrals as the new calves were marked with the double C. Elias spent his days in the saddle, his slicker coated in mud, riding the swollen banks of the Sweetwater to check for washed-out crossings. Ruth Cooper found herself moving through these days with a heaviness she could not quite shake. At first, she blamed the long, dark winter and the ceaseless work of managing a large household, but the fatigue was different now. It sat in her marrow. In the mornings, the smell of frying bacon, which usually made her stomach rumble with hunger, now made the room spin. She would grip the edge of the washstand until the wave of nausea passed, staring at her pale reflection in the small mirror. A thought, dangerous and terrifying, began to stir in the back of her mind. She pushed it away instantly. Hope, she had learned, was a treacherous thing. To hope for a child after everything, after her own history of loss, and after Elias's confession of his barrenness, felt like inviting a lightning strike. One afternoon, the sky was a mottled gray, threatening more rain. Ruth was on the porch, shaking out a rug, when a rider appeared at the ranch gate. He did not ride like a cowhand. He sat his horse with a stiffness that suggested he preferred a carriage. As he drew closer, Ruth saw a man who bore a striking, distorted resemblance to her husband. It was Wade Cooper. He wore a city coat that looked sharply out of place against the backdrop of muddy corrals and weather-beaten barns. His hat was clean, his boots polished beneath the splash of road mud. He had Elias's dark eyes, but where Elias's gaze was deep and guarded, Wade's was shifting and bright with calculation. Elias walked out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. Ruth watched the brothers meet. There was no embrace, no handshake. They stood 6 feet apart, 2 fence posts that could never support the same wire. Wade dismounted, tossing his reins to a stable boy without looking at him. He walked up the porch steps, his eyes fixing on Ruth. "So," he said, his voice smooth as oiled leather, "this is the lady of the house." Ruth stiffened but dipped her head politely. "I am Ruth Cooper." Wade smiled. It was a smile that did not reach his eyes. Wade Cooper, the younger, and some would say, the more unfortunate brother. I heard Elias had taken a wife. I had to come and see the happy couple for myself. A family visit, you understand. Elias stepped onto the porch, placing himself subtly between Wade and the front door. "You are a long way from Denver. Wade." "Business brings me closer than you think," Wade said, dusting off his sleeve. "And a concern for the family legacy." "Of course." He turned his gaze back to Ruth, looking her up and down with an appraisal that made her feel as though she were livestock being judged for auction. He took her hand, bringing it to his lips. His mustache grazed her skin, and Ruth had to fight the urge to pull away. Charmed. Sister-in-law, Wade murmured. The glint in his eyes sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the damp air. It was a look of knowing, a look that said he saw right through the new dress and the gold ring to the desperate woman underneath. Supper that night was an exercise in tension. Mrs. Pratt slammed the plates down with more force than necessary, her disapproval of the guest radiating off her like heat from the stove. Wade sat at the table as if he owned it, drinking Elias's best whiskey and picking at the roast beef. He spent the first half of the meal asking pointed questions about the herd count and the winter losses, his tone suggesting that Elias was mismanaging the asset. Then he leaned back, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "I must say, Elias, you surprised us all," Wade said lightly. "Marrying so suddenly. And without an introduction to the family, it looks impulsive. I do not answer to you." "Wade," Elias said. His voice was low, a rumble of thunder in the quiet room. "Of course not," Wade conceded. "But you do answer to Father's will. You remember the terms. I am sure the deadline is approaching. Without a legitimate heir, a child of your body, the trust dissolves, and the land title opens up to contest. The bank and the courts might view my claim as the more stable one, especially if they believe the current management is erratic." Ruth sat very still, her hands folded in her lap. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. Wade looked at Ruth, his smile widening. It makes one wonder if this marriage was a matter of the heart, or just a panic. Finding a woman. Where was it? In the street? And making her a wife overnight? He took a sip of whiskey. It is a noble charity. Elias. Really, most men would have just given a stray a meal and sent her on her way. But to marry her? Some might say you are desperate. And some women, well, they look for the fattest cow to latch onto when the winter gets cold. The fork in Elias's hand bent slightly under the pressure of his grip. "That is enough," Elias said. The silence that followed was absolute. "Keep your tongue off my wife. Wade, Ruth is the mistress of this house. You will treat her with respect, or you will sleep in the barn with the horses." Wade held up his hands in mock surrender. "Peace, brother. I meant no offense. I'm just looking out for you. Men can be easily tricked when they are lonely." He winked at Ruth, a small, conspiring gesture that made her stomach turn over. She excused herself early, her appetite gone, leaving the brothers to their silent war in the parlor. In the weeks that followed, Wade did not leave. He stayed in the guest room, riding out during the day to inspect the land he clearly felt was already his. But his real work was done in town. Ruth began to feel the change when she went to Bitter Creek for supplies. Before, the townspeople had been cool but polite. Now, the atmosphere was brittle. Wade was a fixture at the saloon and the general store, buying rounds of drinks and telling stories. He spoke of his brother's eccentricity. He dropped hints about Ruth's arrival, how she had come off a freight wagon with nothing, how she had been begging on the street. He painted a picture of a manipulative grifter who had trapped a lonely, simple rancher. It is amazing, isn't it? Ruth heard a woman whisper in the dry goods aisle as she shopped for thread. From sleeping in a stable to wearing silk in a day. You have to wonder what she did to convince him. Ruth kept her eyes forward, her face burning. She wore her plainest dress, trying to look invisible, but she felt the stares prickling her skin. On Sunday, the rejection was absolute. As Ruth walked up the steps of the church, the crowd parted around her like water around a stone. Women she had spoken to the week before suddenly found the horizon fascinating. Mrs. Gable, the banker's wife, pulled her skirts aside as Ruth passed, as if afraid of contamination. "A woman like that," another murmured, loud enough to be heard. "It does not matter how nice the ring is. You cannot wash off the street." Ruth sat in the pew alone. Elias was out at the ranch, dealing with a breached dam. She felt the chill of turned shoulders, a wall of respectable backs shutting her out. She stared at the cross, fighting back tears. She had thought, foolishly, that she had earned her place. Wade had reminded everyone that she was, and would always be, an outsider. The physical toll on Ruth grew heavier. The dizziness became a constant companion. She found herself out of breath after climbing the stairs. Mrs. Pratt, sharp-eyed as a hawk, began to hover. "You are pale as a sheet, Mrs." Pratt scolded one morning, taking the heavy laundry basket from Ruth's hands. "Sit down before you fall down." "I am fine," Ruth protested, though black spots were dancing in her vision. "Just a little tired, Mrs." Pratt made a noise of disbelief. "I have seen that look before. Mrs. Cooper, you need to rest." A tiny spark of hope, refusing to be extinguished, flared in Ruth's chest. Could it be? She lay awake at night, her hand resting flat on her belly, listening to Elias breathe beside her. She was afraid to even whisper the possibility to the dark. If she was wrong, if this was just illness, or the strain of the gossip, the disappointment would crush Elias. And it would prove Wade right. One afternoon, the sun broke through the clouds, heating the damp earth until the air steamed. Ruth was carrying a bucket of water from the pump to the kitchen. It was not heavy, not compared to what she usually carried, but halfway across the yard, the ground seemed to tilt violently to the left. The bucket slipped from her fingers. She reached out, grasping at the air, and then the darkness swallowed her. She woke to the smell of smelling salts and the rough texture of the quilt under her cheek. She was in her bed. The curtains were drawn against the afternoon light. Elias was there. He was pacing the room, his face the color of ash. When he saw her eyes open, he was at her side in an instant, falling to his knees. "Ruth, can you hear me? Elias?" she whispered. Her tongue felt thick. "What happened? You collapsed in the yard," he said, his voice tight with panic. "Hank found you. I sent it to the doctor. He is here now." Ruth tried to sit up, but Elias gently pushed her back. "Lay still, please." The door opened, and Dr. Stanton entered. He was an older man with weary eyes and hands that smelled of carbolic acid. He carried a leather bag that clicked as he set it down. "Mr. Cooper, if you would give us a moment," the doctor said. Elias hesitated, looking from the doctor to Ruth with a desperate, terrified expression. Finally, he nodded and stepped out into the hallway, closing the door but not latching it. The examination was brief but thorough. "Doctor," Stanton asked questions about her monthly courses, her appetite, and the fainting spells. He pressed on her abdomen with practiced hands. When he was finished, he wiped his hands on a towel and sat on the edge of the bed. His expression was grave but gentle. "Well, Mrs. Cooper," he said softly, "it is as I suspected. You are with a child." Ruth let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. The world seemed to stop spinning. A baby, a real, living hope. Tears sprang to her eyes, hot and fast. "But," the doctor continued, raising a hand, "you must listen to me. You are very early, and your body... Ruth, you have lived a hard life. You are thin, and your blood is poor. This fainting is a warning." He leaned closer. "You are at a high risk of losing this child. If you continue to work the way you do, carrying heavy loads, standing all day, you will miscarry. You must rest. You must eat. You must be fragile, even if you do not feel fragile. Do you understand?" Ruth nodded, her hands protective over her stomach. "I understand, Doctor." Stanton stood up and opened the door. "Mr. Cooper, you can come in." Elias stood in the doorway. He looked like a man facing a firing squad. "Well," he rasped, "she is pregnant. Elias." The doctor said. Elias went rigid. He stared at the doctor, then at Ruth. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The shock was physical, a blow that knocked the wind out of him. He gripped the door frame, his knuckles turning white, swaying slightly as if the floor had dropped out from under him. Joy, disbelief, and a crushing Terrible terror warred in his face. He had been told this was impossible. He had built his life around the certainty of his own brokenness. "Alive?" he choked out. "Very much so," the doctor said. "But she is weak. Elias, she needs care. Absolute rest. No lifting, no stress, or you will lose it." From the porch downstairs, a laugh drifted up. It was Wade. He was sitting in the rocking chair, smoking a cigar. He had seen the doctor arrive and had watched Elias's frantic worry with a smug detachment. "A miracle, is it?" Wade's voice carried through the open window, talking to one of the ranch hands. "Amazing how quickly some women conceive after arriving in a new bed. Makes you wonder if the seed was planted before she even got here." Elias did not hear him. He only saw Ruth. He stumbled to the bed and collapsed into the chair beside it, burying his face in the mattress near her hand. His shoulders began to shake. That night, the house was quiet. Elias sat by the bed, watching Ruth sleep. The lamp was turned down to a sliver of golden light. He looked at her face, pale against the white pillow. He looked at the slight curve of her body under the quilt. It might be nothing yet, just a promise of life, but to him, it was everything. He reached out and touched her hand. Tears, hot and unfamiliar, spilled down his cheeks. He hadn't cried when his father died. He hadn't cried since Esther. But the dam had broken. Ruth stirred. She opened her eyes and saw him weeping. "Elias," she whispered. He looked at her, his face wet and unguarded. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice breaking. "It is true," she said. Elias leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers. They clung to each other in the semi-darkness, terrified to name their happiness out loud, lest the wind hear them and snatch it away. "I am scared, Elias," Ruth confessed, her voice trembling. "God took my first hope. Years ago, with Silas. I lost one early. I fear he will punish me again. For the lies, for everything." Elias gripped her hand tighter. "No, he will not." "I am afraid of my body," Elias admitted, his voice raw. "The doctor, he told me years ago that I was the cause, that I was dead to my own children. Every time I look at you, I see Esther. I see the blood. I am terrified that I have done this to you only to break us both." He sat up, wiping his face with his sleeve. "But I vow this to you. Ruth, I will do anything. I will sacrifice anything. I will not let you carry a heavy thing again. I will fight the wind itself if I have to. You and this baby. You are the only things that matter." Wade did not take the news well. When Elias announced it at breakfast the next morning, defiant, proud, and daring Wade to speak, Wade merely raised an eyebrow and offered a toast that dripped with sarcasm. "To the unexpected heir," Wade said, lifting his coffee cup. "Let us hope the child resembles the father. It would be a shame if there were questions." Elias slammed his hand on the table. "One more word." "Wade?" Wade smiled thinly and left the room. But he did not stop his work. He began to press the issue of the will more firmly. He rode into town and visited the marshal's office, claiming he needed to clarify inheritance laws regarding children of dubious parentage. He spent his evenings near the bunkhouse, leaning on the fence rails, talking to the hands who were disgruntled about the extra work the spring thaw required. "He pays you the same, doesn't he?" Wade would murmur, passing a flask of whiskey to a receptive hand. "But he spends money on silk dresses for the stray, and now a baby. That ranch is going to bleed cash. You boys might want to look for work elsewhere before the collapse comes." Seeds of discontent were sown in the mud of the ranch yard. Men looked at Elias with new skepticism. They looked at Ruth with suspicion. Ruth, despite the doctor's orders, felt she could not stay trapped in the house while the poison spread. She convinced Elias to let her ride into town with him on the wagon, promising to sit still while he went to the bank. She needed to visit Mrs. Pratt's sister to pick up some herbs for tea, while waiting on the boardwalk, sitting on a bench to rest. Ruth overheard two women standing around the corner of the Mercantile. Their voices were hushed but clear in the crisp air. "My husband spoke to the marshal," one woman said. Wade Cooper told him there are questions about her first husband, the one who died in Kansas. The other asked, "Died?" The first woman scoffed. "That is the charitable word. Wade says she killed him, says there were strange circumstances. A fall that didn't look like a fall. Mercy." The second woman breathed. "You don't think she is dangerous? A woman who kills one husband might kill another if the price is right, or if he gets in her way. And now she is pregnant. It is a trap, clear as day." The word sliced through Ruth like a skinning knife. Murderer, dangerous. Trap! She felt the blood drain from her face. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Wade knew, or he had guessed. He was twisting the darkest moment of her life into a noose to hang her with. If people believed she was a murderer, they would take the baby. They would come for her. And Elias would be dragged down with her. She stood up, swaying dizzily, and stumbled toward the wagon where Elias was waiting. "Take me home," she gasped. "Please." The ride back was silent. Ruth sat rigid, her hands clutching her belly. The fear was a cold stone in her throat. That evening, the sun set behind the sentinel, painting the sky in violent shades of red. Elias was in the parlor, stoking the fire. He looked up when Ruth entered. She looked like a ghost. "Ruth, what is it?" Ruth stood in the center of the room. She could not hold it anymore. The secret was rotting her from the inside. If Wade was going to use it, Elias had to know the truth. The whole truth. "I have to tell you," she said, her voice cracking. "Tell me what?" Elias moved toward her, concerned, etching deep lines in his forehead. "About Silas," she said, "about how he died." Elias stopped. "You told me he fell. You told me you pushed him. I didn't tell you everything." She sobbed. She sank onto the rug, unable to stand. Elias knelt before her. He came home drunk. She whispered, the words pouring out in a rush. He was angry. He had lost the money for the seed corn. He said it was my fault. He said I was a burden. He grabbed me by the hair. He dragged me to the hearth. She looked at Elias, her eyes wide with the horror of the memory. He was going to kill me. Elias, I saw it in his eyes. He picked up the poker. He raised it. I didn't just push him away. I shoved him with everything I had. I wanted him to fall. I wanted him to stop. She took a shuddering breath. He hit his head on the stone. There was so much blood. It pooled on the floor. It soaked into the cracks. I stood there and watched the light go out of his eyes, and I was glad. She covered her face with her hands. I was glad he was dead. I washed the blood off the poker. I moved the rug. I made it look like an accident. I lied to the sheriff. I lied to the priest. I am a liar and a killer. Elias. And now Wade is telling everyone. They are calling me a murderer. She waited for Elias to pull away. She waited for him to see the monster she was. Instead, strong hands took her wrists and pulled them away from her face. Elias was looking at her. His eyes were not filled with disgust. They were fierce, burning with a protective rage that made the air in the room vibrate. "Ruth, listen to me," he said firmly. He took her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. "Self-defense is not murder. Survival is not a sin. You were a woman alone, fighting a man who meant to end you. You did not murder him. You stopped him. But I lied." She wept. "You survived," Elias repeated. "You did what you had to do to live. If you hadn't, you would be in a grave in Kansas. And we would never have met. This child would not exist." He wiped the tears from her cheeks with his thumbs. "I believe you. I know who you are. You are not a killer. You are a woman who has walked through hell and kept walking." He stood up, pulling her gently to her feet and holding her close, careful of the life between them. "Let Wade talk," Elias vowed, his voice a low growl against her hair. "Let him whisper to the marshal. If he tries to use this against you, he will have to go through me. We will fight him. We will fight the whole town if we have to. This is our family, and no one takes what is mine." Ruth leaned into him, the terrible weight lifting from her shoulders. She was stripped bare, her darkest secret exposed, and she was still held. She was still loved. Outside, the spring wind rattled the window panes. No longer a shriek of winter, but a restless, energetic gust. The fields were turning green in the dark. The calves were wobbling on new legs in the pastures. An uneasy peace settled over the ranch house. It was the calm before the storm, fragile and precious. Wade was out there, scheming in the dark. The town was turning its back. But inside the circle of lamplight, Elias and Ruth stood together, ready to face whatever came for them and their child. The summer arrived in the valley like a fever breaking, replacing the gray damp of spring with a fierce, unrelenting heat. The sun beat down on the sagebrush until the air shimmered, and the dust rose in choking clouds whenever a horse moved faster than a walk. Ruth Cooper's pregnancy had become the center of the ranch's universe. Her belly had swollen tight and high, shifting her balance and making the stairs a daily negotiation. Her back ached with a dull, throbbing persistence, and the heat made her ankles swell until her boots had to be unlaced halfway down. The house had turned into a soft prison. Mrs. Pratt watched her like a hawk, descending with a frown any time Ruth so much as looked at a broom. "Sit down, Mrs. Cooper," the housekeeper would say. Taking the dust rag from Ruth's hand, the doctor said rest. It was not just Mrs. Pratt. Elias hovered. He had become a creature of anxiety, his eyes constantly scanning Ruth for signs of weakness. He rode in from the range earlier than usual, dusty and smelling of sweat, only to check if she had eaten, if she had napped, if she had felt any pain. Ruth felt trapped between gratitude and a sharp, biting irritation. She had spent her entire life defining herself by what her hands could do. She had scrubbed floors until her knuckles bled. She had hauled water. She had survived. Now, being treated like a porcelain doll that might shatter at a touch made her feel useless. It made her feel frightened, as if their expectation of her fragility would somehow summon disaster. One sweltering afternoon, Elias walked into the kitchen to find Ruth lifting a basket of firewood near the stove. It was not heavy, perhaps 3 logs, but the sight of it seemed to snap something inside him. "Put that down," he barked, crossing the room in 2 strides. Ruth jumped, nearly dropping the basket. "Elias, you scared me." "What are you doing?" Elias demanded, snatching the basket from her hands. His face was dark with fear that looked dangerously like anger. "Do you want to hurt yourself? Do you want to lose the baby? The doctor said no lifting. I am pregnant. Elias, not invalid." Ruth snapped back, her own temper flaring in the heat. "It is 3 pieces of wood. I am perfectly capable of feeding a fire. You are stubborn," he countered, his voice rising. "You risk everything for what? Pride? To prove you are strong? I know you're strong, Ruth, but you are carrying my child." "Your child," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "Is that all I am? A vessel for your heir? You look at me and you do not see a wife. You see an incubator that you are terrified will break. You do not trust me. Elias." Elias flinched as if she had slapped him. "That is not fair," he said quietly. "Is it?" Ruth asked, tears of frustration pricking her eyes. "You treat me like I am already dead. Elias, like Esther." The name hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. Elias stared at her, his jaw working, then turned on his heel and walked out the back door, the screen slamming shut behind him. That evening, Ruth sat alone on the porch. The sun had set, but the heat lingered, radiating up from the floorboards. In the distance, over the jagged silhouette of the sentinel, silent lightning danced, flashes of white illuminating the thunderheads that refused to break. She placed a hand on her belly, feeling the small, fluttering kick of life inside. She wondered if their love, fragile and new as it was, could survive the weight of their fears. Elias was paralyzed by the past, and she was terrified of the future. They were building a house on a foundation of anxiety, and she feared the first real storm would bring it down. Wade Cooper sensed the tension in the house like a wolf scents blood. He had not left. He lingered, a parasite in a silk vest, watching the fractures widen. He began to ride out late in the evenings, inspecting fence lines he had no business checking, giving orders to the hands that contradicted Elias's instructions. He acted as though the transfer of power was inevitable, merely a matter of waiting out the clock. One evening, he found Ruth in the garden, pulling weeds in the twilight. He leaned against the gate, smoking a cheroot. "You look tired, sister-in-law," he said, his voice smooth. "Elias working you hard? Or is it just the burden of carrying a legacy that isn't quite secure?" "Go away." "Wade," Ruth said without looking up. "You know," he continued, flicking ash onto her tomato plants, "women like you often end up alone again. It is a cycle, isn't it? You find a protector, he fails or dies, and you are back on the street. Only next time, you will have a brat on your hip. It'll be harder to find a warm bed then." Ruth stood up, wiping dirt from her hands. "Is that a threat?" "It is a prediction." Wade smiled. "Elias is a weak man. Ruth, he cracks under pressure. And you? You are just a variable in an equation that is about to resolve itself in my favor." 2 nights later, the air was thick and still, the kind of silence that precedes violence. Elias had gone to bed early, exhausted. Ruth was in the parlor, unable to sleep, reading by a low lamp. A sound from outside made her look up, a low, rumbling vibration that she felt in the soles of her feet before she heard it. Then, chaos erupted. Shouts drifted from the bunkhouse. The vibration grew into a roar. Ruth stood up, heart pounding, and walked to the window. Shapes were moving in the darkness, huge, dark shapes thundering past the garden fence. Cattle, hundreds of them. Ruth stepped out onto the porch. The moon was obscured by clouds, but she could see the frantic movement of the herd. They were running hard, spooked and panicked, heading straight for the yard. "Elias!" she screamed, turning back to the house. He was already coming down the stairs, pulling on his boots, his shirt unbuttoned. "What is it? Stampede!" Ruth cried. "They are in the yard!" Elias swore and ran out the door, not stopping for his coat. He whistled for his horse, but the animals in the corral were screaming in panic. Ruth stood on the porch, gripping the railing. The noise was deafening. The clatter of hooves, the bellowing of terrified steers, the shouting of men running from the bunkhouse with lanterns. A massive steer, blind with fear, broke from the main mass and swerved toward the house. It crashed through the porch railing with a sound like a gunshot, splintering the wood. Ruth staggered back, tripping over her own hem. She fell hard on her hip, a cry of pain tearing from her throat as she clutched her belly. "Ruth!" Elias, mounted now on a horse he had caught bareback, drove the animal between the steer and the porch. He screamed and waved his hat, turning the beast at the last second. The steer veered off, disappearing into the dark. Elias spun his horse, looking at Ruth. "Get inside!" he roared. "Get inside and bar the door!" He wheeled away, plunging into the swirling dust and confusion to join Hank and the men trying to turn the herd before they destroyed the barns. Ruth crawled into the house, dragging herself upright. She locked the heavy door and leaned against it, shaking uncontrollably. She listened to the shouts, the thud of bodies, the chaos of a world turned upside down. It took 2 hours to bring the herd under control. When the dust settled, the silence that returned to the ranch was heavy and grim. Elias came in, covered in dust and sweat. He found Ruth sitting in the parlor, pale but composed. "Are you hurt?" he asked, dropping to his knees beside her. "The baby. I fell," she said, "but I think I am all right. He is moving." Elias let out a ragged breath. He stood up and paced the room. This was not an accident. "Ruth, cattle do not run like that on a still night unless they are pushed." Hank came to the door a moment later. He held a piece of rope in his hand. It was the knot from the gate of the holding pen. "Cut," Hank said grimly, holding up the frayed end. "Clean cut with a knife. And the south fence. Someone spooked them toward the house on purpose." Elias stared at the rope. His jaw tightened until the tendons stood out like wire. "Wade," he whispered. The next morning, the extent of the damage was clear. 3 steers lay dead, trampled in the panic. A section of the barn wall was stove in. The porch railing was kindling. Elias rode into town alone. He found Wade at the hotel bar, nursing a morning whiskey. Elias walked up to him and slammed the piece of cut rope onto the bar. "You cut my fences," Elias said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "You drove a herd at my house, my pregnant wife." Wade looked at the rope, then at Elias. He laughed, a short, dismissive bark. "You are imagining things, brother. A worried husband's paranoia. Why would I damage my own inheritance? Because you want to break me," Elias said. "You want to scare Ruth off, but you nearly killed her." "Prove it," Wade said, his eyes cold. "Do you have a witness? Did anyone see me, or is this just you, looking for someone to blame for your own incompetence?" The marshal stepped between them before Elias could throw a punch. "Without proof." "Elias, I can do nothing," the lawman said. "Go home. Cool off." Elias rode back to the ranch, a cold knot of certainty in his gut. Wade was escalating. He wasn't just waiting anymore. He was hunting. The breaking point came 3 nights later. Elias was out at the north pasture, checking on a cow that was calving late. The house was quiet. Mrs. Pratt was in a room sewing. Ruth was in the parlor, trying to mend a shirt, though her hands were trembling. A heavy pounding shook the front door. "Mrs. Pratt went to answer it. Ruth heard voices. Mrs. Pratt's sharp, indignant tone, and then a slur of words that made her blood freeze. "Get out of my way, you old hag. I want to see my sister-in-law." It was Wade, and he was drunk. Ruth stood up, her hand going to the back of the chair for support. The parlor door flew open. Wade stumbled in. He reeked of cheap whiskey and sweat. His coat was unbuttoned, his eyes bloodshot and wild. "There she is," he sneered. "The lady of the manor, sitting in my mother's chair. Wade, get out," Ruth said, her voice trembling but firm. "Elias will be back soon." "Elias," Wade spat. "Elias is a fool. He can't even protect his own fences. How is he going to protect you?" He took a step toward her. "You think you have won, don't you? You think because you have a bastard in your belly, you get it all, the land, the money, the respect." He laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "It's mine. Ruth, it was always supposed to be mine. I'm the one with the head for business. I'm the one who should be running this place, not playing nursemaid to a barren cripple and his stray dog." He lunged, grabbing her wrist. His grip was wet and hard. "Come with me," he hissed, pulling her close. His breath smelled of rot. "Leave him. I'll set you up in town. I'll give you money, a house, safety. Just sign a paper saying the child isn't his. Say you tricked him." Ruth recoiled, memories of Silas crashing over her, the smell of liquor, the entitlement, the violence. "Let go of me!" she screamed. She twisted, trying to break his grip. Wade laughed and tightened his hold, twisting her arm behind her back. "You listen to me, you little—" The front door slammed open. Elias stood there. He took in the scene in a single heartbeat. Wade's hand on Ruth, the fear in her eyes. He did not speak. He roared. He crossed the room like a charging bull. He hit Wade with the force of a freight train, tackling him away from Ruth. The 2 men crashed into a side table, shattering a lamp. They rolled on the floor, a tangle of limbs and fury. Elias was punching blindly, his rage overflowing. Wade, desperate and drunk, clawed at Elias's face. He managed to kick Elias off, scrambling backward toward the fireplace. He reached into his coat and pulled out a revolver. "I'm tired of waiting," Wade screamed, leveling the gun at Elias, who was getting to his knees. "I'm tired of you denying me what's mine." Ruth saw the black bore of the pistol. She saw Elias, unarmed, staring down death. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. The sound of the wind outside faded. She was standing near the desk. The drawer where Elias kept the emergency pistol, a small Navy Colt, was slightly open. She did not think. She did not weigh the moral cost. She reached into the drawer. Her hand closed around the cold grip of the gun. She pulled it out. It was heavy. Her hands were shaking violently. Wade cocked the hammer. Ruth raised the gun. She aimed at the mass of Wade's coat. "Stop!" she screamed. Wade turned his head, distraction flickering in his eyes. Ruth pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the small room. The recoil jarred her arm up to the shoulder. The bullet did not hit Wade's chest. It grazed his shoulder, tearing through the fabric and flesh. Wade howled, a high, shocked sound. The impact spun him around. His gun clattered to the floor. He clutched his shoulder, blood welling dark between his fingers. "You shot me!" he shrieked, staring at Ruth with disbelief. "You crazy whore! You shot me!" Elias was on him in a second. He kicked Wade's gun away and pinned his brother to the floor. His forearm pressed against Wade's throat. Hank and 3 ranch hands burst into the room. Guns drawn by the sound of the shot. They stopped, staring at the tableau, the shattered lamp. Wade bleeding on the rug, Elias pinning him, and Ruth standing by the desk, the smoking pistol still in her hand, her face white as chalk. The hearing was held 2 days later in the back room of the marshal's office. It was not a trial, but an inquiry. The town was buzzing. The homeless widow had shot her brother-in-law. Ruth sat in a wooden chair, her hands folded over her belly. She felt hollowed out. The marshal, a stern man named Miller, sat behind his desk. Wade sat opposite her, his arm in a sling, his face pale and venomous. He claimed she ambushed him. He claimed he had come to make peace, and she had pulled a gun on him in a fit of hysteria. "She is dangerous. Marshal," Wade hissed. "She killed her first husband. Ask anyone in Kansas. She has a taste for blood." Ruth looked at the marshal. She did not look at the floor. "He came drunk," she said clearly. Her voice did not shake. "He forced his way in. He threatened me. He attacked my husband. He drew a weapon on an unarmed man. Mrs. Pratt stood up. "I saw him push past me. Marshal, he was reeking of liquor. He called her terrible names." Hank stepped forward. "I saw the gun in his hand. Marshal, when we came in, his Colt was on the floor. Cocked. Elias didn't have a weapon on him." The marshal looked at Wade. "You drew on your own brother in his home?" "He attacked me," Wade shouted. "Because you were assaulting his wife," Elias said, his voice cold steel. The doctor stepped forward next. "Marshal, Mrs. Cooper is 7 months pregnant. She is under strict orders to rest. The stress of this attack, it puts 2 lives at risk." The marshal was quiet for a long time. He looked at the cut rope Elias had brought in as evidence of the earlier sabotage. He looked at Ruth's pale face. Finally, he leaned back. "Self-defense," he ruled. "Clear as day. Wade Cooper, you trespassed. You assaulted a woman and you drew a deadly weapon." He pointed a finger at Wade. "You are done here. I want you out of this territory by sunset. If I see you in Bitter Creek tomorrow, I will arrest you for attempted murder." "And the inheritance?" Elias's lawyer asked. The lawyer cleared his throat. "The will is specific. Any child born in wedlock, the law does not care about rumors. Mr. Wade." "If Elias acknowledges the child is the heir. Your claim is void." Wade stood up. He looked at Elias, then at Ruth. His eyes were full of a hate that would never burn out. "You think you won," he spat, "but you have to live with her. You have to sleep with a killer. Good luck, brother." He stormed out. Ruth let out a breath, her shoulders sagging. It was over. The ghost of Silas, the threat of Wade. She had faced them down. She had pulled the trigger, and the world had not ended. She had protected her home. They rode back to the ranch in the wagon. The sun was setting, turning the sky a bruised purple. Ruth felt lighter, strangely empty but free. Then, the pain hit. It started low in her back, a tightening that wrapped around her belly like a vice. She gasped, gripping Elias's arm. "Ruth?" Elias asked, looking at her sharply. The wagon hit a rut. A sharp, tearing pain shot through her. "Elias," she gasped. "Something is wrong." He looked at her face, seeing the sudden sweat, the dilated pupils. "The baby?" he asked, panic flaring in his eyes. "It is too soon," Ruth whispered. "It is too soon." Elias snapped the reins. The horses surged forward. "Hold on, Ruth, hold on!" The night became a blur of wind and agony. The wind rose, howling around the corners of the ranch house, rattling the sash weights in the windows. Ruth lay in the big bed, twisting in the sheets. The pain was not like the dull ache of work. It was a rhythmic, tearing force that seemed determined to split her in two. The midwife, a woman named Mrs. Weber, who lived 3 miles down the road, had arrived within the hour. Summoned by a frantic Hank, she was stern and efficient, ordering Elias out of the room, then calling him back in when Ruth screamed for him. "It is early," Mrs. Weber muttered, wiping Ruth's forehead. "Small, but my head is down." Ruth gripped the headboard. She was terrified. She remembered the whispers about Esther. Died in the blood, died screaming. "Elias," she gasped during a lull in the contractions. "I am here," he said. He was kneeling by the bed, his face gray. He was holding her hand so hard his knuckles were white. If I don't—" "Stop," Elias ordered. "Do not say it. If I die," Ruth said, forcing the words out. "You do not be alone. You hear me? You find someone. You do not let this house go dark again." "Ruth!" Elias shouted, tears streaming down his face. "You are not going to die. I will not allow it." The pain took her again, a wave that drowned the world. Hours dragged by. The wind screamed. The candle flames danced. Elias prayed. He was not a religious man, but he bargained with the dark. "Take the land. Take the money. I will be barren. I will be dust. Just let her live. Let the baby live. Push, Mrs. Weber commanded. "Now. Ruth!" Ruth pushed. She pushed with the strength of a woman who had survived starvation, abuse, and the scorn of a town. She pushed with everything she had. There was a final, tearing agony, and then silence. The wind howled outside, but the room was dead quiet. The baby lay in the midwife's hands. It was small, blue-tinged, and still. "Oh God," Elias whispered. Ruth fell back against the pillows, exhausted, her eyes closing. "Is it?" The midwife did not answer. She worked frantically. She cleared the tiny mouth. She rubbed the small back with a rough towel. She tapped her feet. "Come on, little one," she muttered. "Breathe. Fight." Seconds stretched into eternity. Elias felt his heart stopping. He saw the grave next to Esther's. He saw the end of everything, and then a sound, a thin, wavering cry. It was weak, terrified, and beautiful. The cry grew stronger. The baby's chest hitched, sucking in air. The blue tinge began to fade into pink. "It's a boy," Mrs. Weber said, her voice thick with relief. "A fighter." She wrapped the baby in a warm flannel cloth and handed him to Ruth. Ruth opened her eyes. She took the bundle. The baby was tiny, so incredibly small, but he was warm. He was squirming. He was covered in blood and vernix. But to Ruth, he was the cleanest, most perfect thing in the world. She looked at his face, the screwed-up eyes, the tiny mouth opening to wail. "He is here," she whispered, tears mixing with the sweat on her face. "Elias, he is here." Elias leaned over. He stared at the child. He stared at the son he was told he would never have. He reached out a trembling finger, and the baby's tiny hand grasped it, a grip surprisingly strong. Elias Cooper, the man of iron and silence, broke. He buried his face in the mattress beside Ruth and sobbed. Great, heaving sobs of relief and gratitude that shook his massive frame. Ruth stroked his hair with one hand, holding their son with the other. "Look at him. Elias," she said softly. "Look at your heir." Elias lifted his head. He looked at his wife, pale and exhausted, but alive. He looked at his son. "He is not my heir," Elias whispered, his voice rough. "He is our miracle." They sat there in the lamplight, the storm outside beginning to fade into a gentle rain. The wind, which had tried to blow them down, now just whispered against the glass. "What shall we name him?" Ruth asked. Elias looked at the baby, then at Ruth. "Samuel," he said. "It means God has heard." Ruth smiled. Samuel. Outside, the first gray light of dawn began to touch the peaks of the Sentinel. The world was washed clean. The mud would dry, the grass would grow, and in the center of the vast, indifferent valley, a house that had been empty was now full. The wind, which had howled like a banshee during the birth, seemed to have exhausted itself. In the days following Samuel's arrival, a hush fell over the Double C Ranch, as if the land itself were holding its breath out of respect for the new life that had taken root in the master bedroom. Ruth Cooper lay against a mound of pillows, her body aching and weary, yet thrumming with a vitality she had never known. The room, once a place of awkward silence and separate sleeping arrangements, was now filled with the sounds of life, the rustle of flannel, the creak of the cradle, and the wet, snuffling cries of the baby. It was a new kind of music, and it changed everything. Elias moved through the house with a strange, terrified gentleness. The man who could rope a steer at full gallop and brand a calf without flinching seemed convinced that his son would break if handled with anything less than the touch of a feather. Ruth watched him from the bed as he paced the floor late one night, the baby draped over his massive shoulder. "Shh, now, little man," Elias rumbled, his voice a low vibration in the quiet room. "The coyotes are just singing. They are not coming for you. I am here." He patted the baby's back with a hand that swallowed the infant's entire torso. His fingers were rough, scarred from barbed wire and rope burns, stained with the indelible grit of the range. Yet, the way he smoothed the blanket, the way he tucked the tiny head under his chin, was the tenderest thing Ruth had ever seen. He caught her watching him in the dim lamplight. He stopped pacing, looking a little sheepish. He would not settle. Elias whispered, "I thought you needed sleep." Ruth smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the quilts. "Bring him here." "Elias." He brought the baby to the bed, lowering him into Ruth's arms as if he were handing over a crate of nitroglycerin. Elias sat on the edge of the mattress, the springs creaking under his weight. He watched them, mother and child, with a look of unguarded wonder. The haunted cast of his eyes, the shadow that had lived there since Esther died, was gone. In its place was a raw, terrified joy. "He is so small," Elias murmured. "It frightens me." "Ruth, how can something so small survive out here? Because he is half you and half me," Ruth said softly, tracing the line of the baby's jaw. "He is made of stubbornness and iron. Elias, he will survive. Mrs. Pratt, for all her sharp angles and stern lectures on propriety, had dissolved into a puddle of grandmotherly fussing. She pretended to grumble about the extra laundry and the disruption to her schedule, but Ruth caught her humming as she stirred chicken broth on the stove. The housekeeper brought trays of food to the room every few hours, insisting Ruth eat to keep her strength up. "You are too thin, Mrs. Cooper, Mrs." Pratt would scold, placing a bowl of stew on the bedside table. "A nursing mother needs sustenance, not air. And look at that child. He has the Cooper appetite already." She would then spend 10 minutes adjusting the baby's blankets, her knobby fingers lingering on his cheek with a softness that belied her tone. The isolation that had defined Ruth's pregnancy began to fracture. The first crack came in the form of Hank. The foreman knocked on the back door 3 days after the birth, holding his hat in one hand and a small, wrapped bundle in the other. "Just something for the boy," Hank grunted, shoving the package at Mrs. Pratt. It was a wooden horse, whittled from cedar, polished until it shone like glass. It was smooth to the touch, with no sharp edges to hurt a small hand. Then came the pastor, looking embarrassed but determined, clutching a bouquet of wilting wildflowers he had likely picked by the roadside. He offered a prayer over the cradle, asking the Almighty to bless the house, and awkwardly congratulated Elias, shaking his hand with vigor. The town women, the ones who had turned their backs at church, were slower to arrive. But curiosity is a powerful force. Mrs. Gable came first, bringing a basket of apple muffins and a gaze that darted into every corner of the parlor, looking for signs of the squalor she expected from a stray. Instead, she found a clean house, a healthy baby, and a husband who looked at his wife as if she were a queen. By the second week, Ruth felt strong enough to venture out. The first trip back to church was an ordeal she had dreaded, but she refused to hide. She dressed in her best blue calico, wrapped Samuel in a white wool shawl, and climbed into the wagon beside Elias. When they walked up the church steps, the conversation on the lawn died away. Eyes turned. Ruth held her head high, clutching the baby to her chest. Elias walked with his hand on the small of her back, a silent warning to anyone who might offer an insult. There were still whispers. A few women behind fans murmured about the hastiness of the birth or the luck of the mother, but there were fewer turnbacks. Mrs. Miller, the baker's wife, offered a tentative smile. 2 other women nodded. After the service, as they were leaving, the blacksmith's wife approached. She looked at the baby, then at Ruth. "He is a fine boy." "Mrs. Cooper," the woman said. "Strong lungs. I heard him during the hymn." "Thank you," Ruth said. "He likes to make his presence known." The woman hesitated, then lowered her voice. "I'm sorry for the things that were said. About Wade. Before. We were wrong to listen to a man like that." Ruth looked at her. She did not offer gushing forgiveness. She did not have it in her to pretend the wounds weren't there. She simply nodded. "Thank you," she said again. "We are just happy to be at peace." The true peace came a week later. A rider from town brought a thick envelope from the lawyer's office. Elias took it to the porch, sitting in the rocking chair as the sun began to dip behind the ridges. Ruth sat on the steps near his boots, nursing Samuel in the shadow of the porch post. She watched Elias break the wax seal and unfold the heavy paper. He read it slowly, his lips moving slightly with the words. When he finished, he let the hand holding the letter drop to his side. He let out a breath that seemed to expel years of tension from his lungs. "Is it done?" Ruth asked quietly. "It is done," Elias said. He looked out over the yard, where the dust motes danced in the golden light. "The birth is recorded. Samuel Elias Cooper is the legal heir to the Double C Ranch. The trust is secured. Wade's claim is dead." He looked down at her. "The land is safe. Ruth, no one can take it from him, and no one can take it from you." Ruth looked down at the nursing baby. The fear of eviction, of being cast out, of Wade's sneering threats. It all dissolved. "Safe," she whispered. They sat in silence for a long time. It was Elias who spoke first, his voice thoughtful. "My father. He ran this place with an iron fist," Elias said. "He believed that fear made men work harder and that softness made them weak. He never hugged me. He never told me he was proud until he was on his deathbed. And even then, it was a bargaining chip." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I do not want that for Samuel. I do not want a home ruled by silence." "Neither do I," Ruth said. "I want him to know that he can tell us the truth, even if it is ugly. I want him to know that love isn't something he has to earn by being perfect." Elias reached down and touched the baby's head. "Then we will build that kind of home," he said. "We will make mistakes. Ruth, I know I will. I'm a hard man in a hard country, but I will never let him doubt that he is wanted." The resolve to build a peaceful home was tested by the land itself only 10 days later. The sky turned a bruised, sickly green in the middle of the afternoon. The air went still, heavy with a static charge that made the hair on Ruth's arms stand up. Then the hail came. It did not start with rain. It started with stones of ice the size of walnuts, smashing into the dry earth with the sound of gunshots. Within minutes, the stones grew to the size of eggs. They roared against the roof, a deafening cacophony that made Samuel scream in terror. Ruth huddled in the corner of the parlor, shielding the baby with her body. Elias and Mrs. Pratt ran from window to window, checking the glass. It lasted 20 minutes. When it stopped, the silence was more shocking than the noise. Elias went outside. Ruth followed him, stepping gingerly over the ice that carpeted the porch. The devastation was heartbreaking. The small hayfield, which had been green and promising, was shredded into a mat of green pulp. The vegetable garden was beaten into the mud. The roof of the bunkhouse was dented and leaking, and the cattle were bruised and skittish, huddled against the fences. Elias stood by the garden gate, looking at the ruin of the hay. His shoulders slumped. It was a significant financial blow. That hay was meant to feed the stock through the winter. Ruth walked up to him. She took his hand. "We will replant?" she asked. "It is too late for hay," Elias said, his voice flat. "We will have to buy feed. It will take every dollar we have in the bank. We will be tight. Ruth may be hungry." "We have been hungry before," Ruth said firmly. "We have a roof, we have the stock, and we have neighbors." Elias looked at her. "Neighbors? The storm hit the Miller place too," Ruth said. "And the Jensens. If we pool the labor, if we help them fix their roofs, maybe they have extra feed to trade. We cannot do this alone. Elias, pride is too expensive this year." Elias looked at her, seeing the steel in her spine. She was right. The days of the Double C standing as an island were over. The next day, Elias rode out not to check his fences, but to visit the neighbors. He offered his hands to help repair the Jensen's barn. In return, Mr. Jensen offered a portion of his oat crop which had survived in the lower field. Ruth and Mrs. Pratt baked bread and took it to the Millers, whose kitchen had been flooded. It was an imperfect community. There were still old grudges and new jealousies, but in the face of the ice, the valley pulled together. The sense of isolation that had defined Ruth's arrival began to fade, replaced by the rough, necessary bonds of survival. On the next Sunday, Ruth stood a little taller in the churchyard. She wore her old dress, saving the new one, but she wore it with dignity. Mrs. Gable approached her near the gate. The banker's wife looked at the baby, then at Ruth. Her eyes were rimmed with a strange mixture of envy and regret. "You are lucky, Mrs. Cooper." "Mrs. Gable murmured, adjusting her silk gloves. "To fall off a wagon and land in the arms of a man like Elias. To have a child so easily. Some women pray for years and get nothing. You have been very lucky." Ruth looked at the woman. She thought of the stable floor where she had slept. She thought of the hunger that had made her dizzy. She thought of Silas and the poker, of Wade and the gun, of the labor that had nearly torn her apart. She shifted Samuel to her other hip. Luck had very little to do with it. "Mrs. Gable," Ruth said quietly, "I did not fall into a soft bed. I climbed out of a hard hole, inch by inch. Elias and I. We built it scar by scar." "Mrs." Gable blinked, taken aback by the directness. She opened her mouth, then closed it. She nodded once, stiffly, and walked away. Ruth watched her go, feeling a sense of lightness. She did not need their approval. She knew what she had survived. As the weeks turned into months, the summer heat began to mellow into the golden haze of autumn. Ruth's body healed, the pain in her back faded, and her strength returned, doubled by the lifting of the child. She began to join Elias on his evening checks. They would walk to the ridge overlooking the valley, Ruth carrying Samuel in a sling across her chest. They would stand there, the wind whipping at their clothes, watching the light play across the miles of grass and sage. One evening in October, the air was crisp enough to require a shawl. Elias turned to Ruth. "Mrs. Pratt offered to take Samuel for the night," he said. "She says she wants to try him on a bottle of goat's milk to get him used to it. She says we look like we need a night." Ruth felt a sudden spike of anxiety. She had not been separated from Samuel for more than an hour since his birth. "But if he cries?" she asked. "She is down the hall," Elias said. "We will hear him." He took her hand. "Ruth, look at me." "I miss my wife." Ruth looked up at him. She saw the longing in his eyes, not just for her body, but for her attention, for the woman who existed separate from the mother. "All right," she whispered. The house felt strangely quiet without the baby in the room. They ate supper at the kitchen table, stew and fresh bread, talking not about diapers or feed prices, but about the books Elias had read, about Ruth's memories of her childhood before the farm failed. They saw each other again. After dinner, Elias walked to the porch and retrieved an old fiddle case that belonged to one of the hands. He didn't play well, but he could scratch out a slow, mournful tune. He put a record on the phonograph instead, deciding against inflicting his playing on her. A waltz, scratched and hissing, filled the parlor. "May I?" he asked, holding out his hand. Ruth stepped into his arms. They moved slowly in the lamplight. Her head rested on his chest, listening to the steady thump of his heart. His hand splayed across the small of her back, warm and possessive. In the hush, Elias spoke. "I kept that note," he said softly. "The doctor's note. For years, I kept it like a penance. I thought it was my definition." Ruth pulled back to look at him. "Where is it now?" "I burned it," he said. "The morning Samuel was born. I threw it on the stove." Ruth smiled, tears touching her eyes. "I still dream of the stable," she confessed. "I dream that I am back in the straw, freezing, and you don't come." Elias pulled her closer, his grip tightening. "I will always come. Ruth, I will always find you." Saying the fears aloud stripped them of their power. The ghosts of the stable and the doctor's office drifted away, banished by the warmth of the room and the reality of the child sleeping down the hall. Elias kissed her. It was not the frantic, terrified kiss of the blizzard. It was deep, sure, and unhurried. It was the kiss of a man who knew he was home. Ruth responded, her hands slipping under his shirt to feel the warm skin of his back. The fear that had haunted their bed, the fear of pain, of failure, of using each other, was gone. They went upstairs together. Their lovemaking was slow and intense, a conversation without words. Ruth felt cherished, every touch a validation of her worth. Elias felt whole, the broken pieces of his past fused together by her presence. They pushed the boundaries of their intimacy, finding a vulnerability that required total trust as they lay together afterward. The wind sighing outside. Ruth knew that the storm could no longer touch them. The years did not stop for the Coopers. They moved with the seasons, hard winters giving way to green springs. The home they built grew to encompass more than just their blood. The next winter, a young ranch hand named Toby broke his leg and had no family to take him in. Elias moved him into the spare room, and Ruth nursed him back to health. He stayed on as the foreman when Hank finally retired. 2 years later, a neighbor's niece was orphaned. Ruth, remembering her own desperation, took the girl in until her aunt could arrive from the east. The girl cried for 3 days, but by the 4th, she was baking bread with Ruth and laughing at Elias's attempts to tell jokes. The house became a shelter. Elias, who had once thought his legacy was merely genetic, realized that family was something you forged, not just something you bred. One golden evening, 5 years after the day Ruth had arrived on the freight wagon, she stood in the doorway of the ranch house. The yard was bathed in the amber light of sunset. The dust hung in the air like gold dust. In the center of the corral, Elias was walking a small, shaggy pony. Sitting on the pony's back, gripping the mane with fierce determination, was Samuel. He was a sturdy boy with Ruth's gray eyes and Elias's dark hair. "Look at me, Mama!" Samuel shouted, his voice piping clear across the yard. "I am riding!" Ruth stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "I see you, Sam! Keep your heels down!" Elias looked over his shoulder at her. His face, lined by the sun and wind, broke into a smile that lit up the dusk. It was a smile of pure, uncomplicated joy. "He is a natural." "Ruth!" Elias called out. Ruth walked down the steps and crossed the yard to the fence. She leaned against the rail, watching her husband and son. The wind was blowing, as it always did in Wyoming. It tugged at her skirt and loosened a strand of hair. It was still harsh. The land was still stubborn. The winters were still brutal. They had lost cattle to disease. They had fought fires. They had buried friends. But as Elias lifted Samuel down from the pony and swung him into the air, the boy's laughter rising like a prayer into the vast sky, Ruth felt a warmth pressed against her side that no wind could chill. She thought of the girl who had stood on the main street of Bitter Creek with a carpetbag and a hollow stomach. She thought of the man who had sat in the dark, believing he was the end of his line, against the prejudice of the town, the cruelty of Wade, and the unforgiving nature of the West. They had built something rare. They had built a home where pain and tenderness, justice and mercy, fear and desire all lived together. Elias walked toward her, carrying Samuel, who was babbling about his ride. Elias put his free arm around Ruth's waist, pulling her close. "Supper ready?" he asked, kissing her temple. "It is on the stove," Ruth said, leaning into him. "Let's go home." They turned and walked toward the house, the windows glowing with yellow light against the deepening purple of the hills. The storm would come again. It always did, but Ruth knew, with a certainty that went down to her bones, that their love was finally, undeniably, stronger than the wind. Thank you so much for listening to the story of Ruth and Elias. It has been a journey through the dust and snow of the American West, exploring how two broken people can build a whole life together. I hope their story touched something in you. I would love to hear where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts on the story in English. Did Ruth's courage inspire you? Did Elias's transformation surprise you? Let's talk about it. If you enjoyed this tale, please make sure to subscribe to From Wild West so you never miss an episode of romance, adventure, and history under the big open sky. Until next time, keep your fires burning warm